courageux issus de cette deuxième journée de rencontres et d'échanges pour ce colloque Interroger le musée universitaire et ses frontières. Alors nous allons aujourd'hui avoir le plaisir d'écouter Martha Lorenzo et puis Marjane Doux. Nous allons enchaîner les deux communications de plus ou moins 45 minutes pour pouvoir faire une pause café à 10h30 et reprendre à 11h pour les échanges avec la salle. Je devais vous faire deux petites communications de service. La première, c'est que bien malheureusement, la table ronde avec les membres du réseau unique est annulée. Nous n'avons pas pu rassembler tous les membres du réseau et donc nous avons préféré annuler cette table ronde qui pourra peut-être être reprogrammée par la suite. Avant de céder la parole à André Gob, et que je remercie pour cette présidence de séance, et à Jean-Louis Postula, encore deux petites communications, oui, c'est que je vous ai mis, hier j'ai parlé de la publication des actes du colloque d'il y a 2 ans. Donc voilà, je vous ai mis l'adresse musée.mdr.mu, qui est d'ailleurs l'adresse du pôle muséal et culturel, où vous avez une présentation des collections, des musées, mais également des publications dans ces actes. L'autre communication, c'est que hier, et c'est aussi à ça que sert un colloque, des liens se sont noués entre différentes personnes et il a été envisagé de proposer une visite du Trinquol Museum. Et juste pour dire, je pense que c'est M. Wassio qui était intéressé par cela, que Carla Blanche se tient à votre disposition à l'issue du déjeuner, donc vers 14h, à la salle des professeurs. On pourra faire un petit groupe et Carla se tient, et je leur remercie, se tient à la disposition de ceux que ça intéresse pour faire cette visite du Trinquol Museum. Je cède la parole à André Gob.
Tu parles des échanges. J'ai eu une idée hier, et puis, enfin une idée. Ce qui serait bien, c'est qu'on ait une liste des participants avec les adresses mail.
Oui.
Pour contacter quelqu'un.
Bien sûr. Donc on va essayer de...
C'est classique.
Oui, c'est clair. On va essayer de rassembler tout ça et de vous faire parvenir des informations en clôture de ce colloque. Et je vous cède la parole, André. Je vous remercie encore une fois.
Merci. Pas besoin de me remercier, je fais ça avec plaisir. D'autant que la première intervenante, Martha Lorenzo, est quelqu'un que je connais, qui nous a accueillis remarquablement il y a quelques années à Lisbonne. Donc, j'ai gardé un excellent souvenir de ce séjour. Alors, Martha est directrice du musée d'histoire naturelle et des sciences, je le dis en français, de l'Université de Lisbonne. Elle le dira peut-être en portugais. Elle a fait une thèse de doctorat il y a un certain nombre d'années au CNAM. On retrouve notre ami Yves, même si je ne sais pas s'il était dans le jury, je crois qu'il n'était pas encore au CNAM à ce moment-là, qui était sur les musées et collections universitaires en Europe. Donc, cette thèse de doctorat l'a prédestine en quelque sorte non seulement à être ici aujourd'hui, mais aussi à occuper la fonction de président de l'UMAC, le comité spécialisé, transversal, horizontal de l'ICOM, qui se consacre aux musées et collections universitaires. Et elle est présidente, je crois qu'elle a succédé à l'URC il y a une dizaine d'années. Voilà. Alors, elle est également coordinatrice d'un réseau portugais des infrastructures, des collections scientifiques, donc sorte de structure transversale pour le Portugal, pour les musées universitaires ou les collections universitaires. Voilà, je lui cède la parole en lui demandant de respecter le timing de 45 minutes.
Bonjour à toutes et à tous. I will speak in English. Oui. Bonjour à tous et à toutes. I will speak in English this morning for you. I'm really delighted to be here. And I'm grateful to Professor Jean Vinon, to Yves Vanquin, and the organizers of this conference for inviting me. It's a delight. It's my first time in Liège. Liège has been top on my list, but for many reasons we could not coordinate the agendas, and so here I am. A really pleasure. Yesterday I had this wonderful visit. Well, first of all, here, the debates. I learned so much about, this project that you were embarking, but at the same time, it was wonderful to see the dedication and the competence of the staff working in the collections, and I look forward. Apparently, there's some visits organized this afternoon, and I really, really look forward to it. So I think that the pôle muséal et culturel de l'Université de Liège seems to me innovative in multiple fronts, and I think it's really worth following the ideas put forward yesterday. We're learning from other experiences that have been happening in Europe, both in the higher education sector and in the museum sector. I had 2 lectures planned, and then yesterday I said, okay, I'm going to decide what I'm going to talk about, although definitely I will talk about the last 20 years because that's the plan, but I had 2 approaches, kind of. And yesterday I thought of one approach, which is really, I would like to address with you big questions, okay? I know there's a granularity. I know that it's very difficult to compare university museums and collections in different countries, even in Europe, which is kind of a homogeneous situation compared with China, Asia, Latin America, and so on. It's really difficult to, extract major conclusions, but that's what I want to do, okay? I want to dissect a little bit, and then we can come back in the Q&A to the granularity and to the local specificities. I want to address where we are now, which forces, tendencies, internal and external, have brought us here. Are we better than we were 20 years ago? And I started my work in a museum, in a university museum. So I started in the late 1990s, in the museum where I now am director. And my contact through university museums came through UMAC, precisely, because precisely was being organized at that time. And I gave my first talk, public, I was so nervous. Gave my first talk in the first UMAC conference in Barcelona in 2001. And for me, it's very important, personally, the power of being together, the power of networks, and how, I could have done different things, but the way I was welcomed in that meeting, and the way that also in universitaire meetings, as a young professional, it was super, super important. And I never changed, never looked back. It's my tribe, so to speak, university museums. That's where I developed my research and teaching and so on. So, and I can tell you that we are much better, in my view, than we were 20 years ago. So, some examples of things that are unlikely to happen today, but did happen 20 years ago, okay? For example, rectors saying that museums are not a concern of universities. I specifically had one rector of a university that I will not say in Europe that told me, it's not our business. Culture is not our business, museums is not our business, patrimoine, it's not what we are here for. Also, there was, when I started, very, very little literature about university museums and collections, okay? There was absolutely. In fact, I started doing this tour, this grand tour of university collections in Europe. I visited 400, from Ireland to Estonia, which is incredible. It's the best days of my life, you can imagine. I started because I wanted to know, and there was absolutely nothing, no survey, no how many universities are there, how many museums, what's the state of collections, conservation, and so on. And so, yeah, there was nothing in terms of substantial knowledge or even information about university museums and collections. Also, something that is unlikely to happen now, but happened a lot in the late 1990s, early 2000s, was collections orphaned and abandoned. Zero staff, absolutely zero. Being at best transferred to other museums also happened a lot. Or at worst, being sold in the US, for example, in US universities, or trashed at massive scale. Really at massive scale. I do not have evidence, and but anecdotal evidence, oral, testimony. I have a few examples. For example, one university in Europe, which gave to the municipality a major collection of rocks for asphalt, to be transformed into asphalt. A major tons of rocks. Also, in another, and this I have the newspaper, but I couldn't find it yesterday. I think it was in the Netherlands, but I'm not sure. While I was, in the early 2000s, a few bottle flasks of liquid collections with human remains appeared in dumpsters. Right? So, and as I always stayed involved with UMAC and Universium, and regularly I used to have calls for help, crisis, museums going to close, and so on. And I don't know when was the last time that I received any of that type of call. So it would be actually important to a good students, a good topic for research, to find out how much was lost in the late 1990s and early 2000s in European universities, and what types of collections were lost. I will argue that the main force driving change in university museums and collections in the past 20 years was networks. Between 2000 and 2010, national networks, regional networks, and international networks, like Universium and UMAC, and since the 2010s, local networks per university, okay, like the Pole. It's a network. It brings people together, people who work in university museums of a given university, sometimes archives too, so, and sometimes buildings too, okay, so this kind of what I call local networks. But I think it's first important to situate ourselves. Where were we in the late 1990s and early 2000s for these things to happen? Let's characterize a little bit briefly the situation, particularly in Europe. I will focus in Europe. More or less 70 years ago, we finished the golden age. I know we cannot say golden age, but in this context we can. Golden age of university museums in Europe. Until the 1950s, 1960s, the museum was a natural structure of higher education, like a department, like a library, like a laboratory. University museums might not be entirely aligned with the museums outside, but universities knew what museums were. They created them regularly, they funded them regularly, they staffed them regularly. In many disciplines, museums were intrinsic to teaching and research activities, both as a source and as a result. So you have this museum and laboratory, the department and museum. The museum is the department in some disciplines, in many European universities. So museums and collections not only had a clear place in the university, but they were also, many of them, everywhere. Small, large, rich, poor, everywhere. Considerable changes in higher education since the Second World War led to a general deterioration of this clear place. I cannot be exhaustive here. I've written elsewhere about it, but we know what these changes were, okay? And here goes the macro. Major shifts in the subjects and the methods of research, away from collections, museums, and botanic gardens. When botany becomes plant biology, and when geology becomes earth sciences, there is an incredible shift away from collections that is happening here. In fact, in 20 years ago, I didn't come here to Belgium. I didn't look, when in my thesis, I didn't look at Belgium specifically, but I looked at the Netherlands. And 20 years ago, you could not be a paleontologist in the Netherlands. I don't know if the situation has changed, but you could not be. You had to come here to Belgium. That's what I was told, to become a paleontologist, to specialize in fossil studies, right? So this means a lot for the decline of Steven de Klerk, who coordinated the Dutch survey of geological collections in the late 1980s, told me that in 1984 or 1985 academic year, there were 15 students enrolled in geology. Okay, so these changes happened because there was a shift also in the students, in some disciplines, lack of interest and decline of number of students. Also major changes in teaching, some related to the changes of research, others not. Explosive growth of some call massification of universities. Let's not forget the overwhelming majority of universities in Europe were created after the 1960s. Coupled with, increased specialization, the size and cost of lab equipment, which led to an acute lack of space. Space is the most incredible and most important value of a university, space. And great migration of universities from old buildings in city centers to the periphery of cities. And of course, later neoliberal reforms resulting in a gradual but consistent decline in the funding per student more accurately, since the late 1990s, among so many others. So most likely this picture that I'm, drawing here is also familiar, at least in some aspects, here in Liège. The nadir of the recognition of university museums and collections was reached in the late 1980s, late 1990s, a crisis in the real and most dramatic sense of the term. What is the use of university museums? What for? All useless stuff. That's not our problem. It's not our business. We're in another type of things, and so on. It's important to note that while this was happening in the higher education sector in the last 70 years, museums outside the university were also engaged in major changes, of which I would highlight the incredible growth of museums worldwide, also after the 1960s, the increased role of education, sometimes at the cost of research and collections, the recognition of the social role of museums, particularly in economic development, and let's not forget the incredibly important Declaration of Santiago do Chile, which will be 50 years next year. The emergence of ecomuseology, and later new museology in Europe, Canada, Latin America, and so on. Why is this important? It is important because when university museums, in the middle of this crisis, looked at their counterparts outside the university for a sense of identity, of belonging, and to reinvent the University Museum 1.0, museums were no longer the same. The debates were not about collections, teaching, research. This created an extra difficulty for University Museums 2.0. So it was in the midst of this crisis that the first signs of organization appeared. I remember, for example, very early stages of centralized units in some French universities, Montpellier, for example, Strasbourg, it started here, Lyon, the model of the centralized university museum. In other words, either collect all collections under the same roof, one museum per university, or one museum per university plus dispersed collections that the museum would be in charge of. That's the model of the earliest models I know is the Gustavianum in Uppsala and Utrecht University Museum, which had jurisdiction over many, many collections, art collections. It was a scientific museum with jurisdiction over art collections spread over the University of Utrecht, and the same with Uppsala. They were created in the mid-1990s. Also, the UK survey, this is a very important, and also the Dutch survey, but the UK survey had important results for UK university museums, because between 1993 and 2002, all UK universities did a complete systematic survey with the same methodology, open every doors and so on, counting everything of their museums, collections, and heritage, and that resulted, I can explain in the Q&A, in dedicated funding. It's the only country that I know that has sustained dedicated funding for university museums outside the formula, okay? I can explain this a little bit later. So, but everyone was very isolated at the time, doing their very best with little funding, little recognition against everyone, sometimes in their own universities. The earliest associations of university museums, the earliest networks, happened at national level, okay? So one of the first was in South Korea, so not relevant here in Europe. Then there was Brazil, the US also, and it was in the UK that there were the earliest formal national associations of university museums. So in England, not in England, in the UK proper and in Scotland. They still exist today. And of course, Universeum, the European Academic Heritage Network, and UMAC, ICOM's Committee for University Museums and Collections, were created in 2000 and 2001, respectively. I need a bit of water. So, ICOM's origins, we're doing a wonderful thing that's giving me a lot of pleasure, and sometimes Sébastien helps me in that thing, which is trying to interview online, on Zoom, the people who were involved in the creation of UMAC, you know, so kind of oral archive. And it's everything online in the UMAC website. And apparently, there's some contradiction there. You know, our oral history, there's some contradictions that we need to sort out. But apparently, UMAC was created resulting from two meetings, one in Melbourne in 1998, the ICOM General Conference. There was already some movement there. And particularly a meeting in Paris that happened under the auspices of the Finnish embassy. I have no idea why, don't ask me why Finland was involved in that, promoting that. It's something that we need to find out. But anyway, there was people getting together, and those were the kind of the early founding fathers of UMAC, which would then went to ICOM and say, we need a committee, specific committee for university museums and collections. which was something that for ICOM at that time was kind of collections. The museum, we're museums organization. We don't deal with collections. What do you mean collections? Collections exist in museums. And so there was some debate. It was not easy. I can also enter into those details in the Q&A. But ultimately, UMAC was created. So there was a vote and UMAC was created, met first General Assembly, as I said, in 2001. Universiam had even a more complicated, so to speak, kickoff, because Universiam started not from also from professionals, but inside the higher education sector. There's a difference there. That's the first difference. And the second difference is that it started as an informal meeting. An informal, people met this year here, next year there. And then we kind of reached a situation in 2007, we were talking about it yesterday, that, where are we going? Because there was, we really didn't have, so we decided to formalize and so on, but it was complicated to have this. So these first networks, both national level and then international level, had mostly three objectives. First, raise awareness pour la sauvegarde, given a situation of vulnerability and risk. On the other hand, the mobilization and legitimization of a certain professional collective who wanted clearly to identify themselves and align themselves with the sector of museums and culture. And finally, the recognition of the heritage of universities as a heritage of its own right within cultural heritage. It's there that we start talking about the patrimoine des universités. So important achievements of these early networks, I think, was ICOM recognition, which was absolutely vital. The recognition from the museum sector that we were a specific group with for specific needs, specific ambitions, specific, dimensions of museology, and not only museology. So that was the first. And then I would highlight a second very important achievement of that early stage, which is the recognition by the Council of Europe. So there was a recommendation in 2005, unanimously approved by the Committee of Ministers on the governance and management of university heritage. So I can give you that if you need it. It's still very important today. I still use it daily to convince, when there's convincing to be needed. We had a second wave of networks, so the local networks per university. So the poll here is one example. But these, as I will explain briefly, are more difficult. They require, first of all, local recognition of the museums and heritage, so university recognition. They require aligned professionals all working together towards an end. And they force us to transcend disciplinary barriers and other barriers, to homogenize the practices and to intervene socially and politically, to share knowledge and tools and so on. So they are more recent because how can I explain this? Sometimes it's more difficult to talk to your colleague that's inside the university than to talk to the colleagues in other university or in another country. We all have this experience. And so if we exclude Italy, Italy is a case avant la lettre because Italy had a sistema museale per university created in 2002. Every single university in Italy had a system, which is a network, created in 2002 by the CRUI, the National Conference of Rectors of Italy. And so if we exclude that, all the networks I know of are of the last 5 to 8 years. Local networks. I find these local networks very, very important, because International networks, they're fine, they're important. Even as president of UMAC, I have to recognize that the situation is so heterogeneous around the world. It's difficult to do something, apart from sharing experiences and meeting colleagues, it's difficult to kind of, okay, a policy for the world of university museums, or what, it's difficult. So what we can do as UMAC or Universium is really to give international visibility to the university museums and collections, for example, to the University of Liège, or whatever. And that's very important because universities prize a lot internationalization, more than the museum sector. So that's a very important thing. But the real work is done at university level. That's the real hard, difficult work of coming together, of achieving things locally. And this second generation, so to speak, I hate that word, but anyway, this second generation of networks, they are not reactive networks, okay? They are not reacting to a crisis. They are active in the sense of, we have things to say, we have a voice, we want to be heard, and we are going to get together to achieve something. So I think that's very important. And if we take them seriously, and that means not excluding anything, if we take them seriously, they force us to think transversally the university in a way that the university never thought of thinking itself transversally. We are actually pushing the university to look at itself. How long do I have? 10 minutes, 5 minutes. Just for control. 10 minutes, fine. So, yeah, there were other external factors. There are many, many factors, okay, but these are just some notes, and then we can talk more about it, we can discuss, but I think there was at least one very important external factor that brought us here to a better situation than we were 20 years ago. And that is an interest in collections-based research and teaching. You have, researchers from all areas are coming back to museums. Not only university museums, but of course, university museums have always organized, it's familiar territory for them. But they're coming back often with spectacular results, you know. Old scientific, in the sciences is incredible. There's not one single week that we don't hear or have a paper in Nature about, you know, putting back human evolution 300,000 years because of new dating techniques and so on. So there is this incredible field expanding where old scientific collections, herbarium, fossils, but also new ones such as tissue banks and DNA banks, seed banks, cell culture banks, audio banks are contributing to vibrant and cool new fields of studies, such as paleoanthropology, human evolution, animal domestication, incredible recent news about animal domestication, the horse, the dog, everything is under question now. Based on what? In most of the cases, collections. And that is not said for reasons I can also explain in the Q&A, because it's not referenced in the paper that it comes from, that the source comes from a museum. This is mostly due to technological advances, looking at objects, specimens, artifacts in new ways, methods such as next-generation sequencing, ancient DNA, it's incredible, CT and PET scanning, among others, are enabling us to look inside things, deeper inside things, into the invisibility of materiality. Also, new digitization techniques are making accessible enough 3D information to conduct research without handling specimens. That creates another different problems altogether, but reaching amateur, this allows amateurs and citizen science to be reached through 3D scanning. And of course, historians, I could stay until midnight talking about the material turn in historians, but everyone knows that historians are increasingly using and interested in sources. Also, there was another external factor, because I think that there has been an increased interest from the museum sector in us as university museums, okay? And there has been some significant partnerships that did not happen before between university museums, universities, and municipal museums, city museums, national museums, and so on. For example, Trento, for example, Strasbourg, there's this incredible thing coming up, different, because it's come from the university, it comes from the city, and it's exciting. What are the achievements of the second wave of networks? So we now have an incredible body of literature, because you see these networks meet every year. They publish proceedings, seminars, and so on. We now have incredible, it's very dispersed. I feel that the students, a good state-of-the-art would be wonderful to, to combine and review the literature that has been published. It's really immense. Then we're starting to have, resulting from these local networks, the first in-depth policies and surveys also, but I want to specifically focus on policies for university heritage, including everything. So something approved by the Senate or the university board or whatever that includes museums, collections, archives, buildings, and everything. And these policies are incredibly innovative because, it's ICOMOS on one side, ICOM on the other side, ICA on the other side. All this is very fragmented. So again, universities are leading the way on how to cross all this and make it, and bring it to society, how to use it. So the University of Alberta was among the first to have a local policy, university policy for that, for university museums, archives, and so on. University of Sydney, too. Brazil is incredible. Brazil, despite, that terrible president that they have, local networks like this one are exploding. And policies, they're rehearsing many times. It's not perfect, but they're going ahead, maybe as a way of resisting, so there's something that probably there's some things to study there. But most importantly, I think that the most incredible and visible achievement that we've been having of this of the past decade is certainly new projects with new approaches. So museums innovating, the Science Gallery franchise from Trinity College, Dublin. We see new university museums in Africa, in China, of course, in Japan, Korea, the US, in Brazil, Colombia, Mexico, in Europe. We see new projects recently opened or about to open or open soon. Here in Liège, it's gonna happen. All over Belgium, what's going on with Belgium? Belgium is incredible. It's incredible what is happening everywhere. The GAM, Mons, but also Padova. 2 weeks ago, the new museum opened in Padova, Museum of Science, History of Science. We have to go there, definitely. Turin, Utrecht, also closed to be reopened. Coimbra, Berlin, Leuven, Oslo, Bergen, Helsinki, Manchester, closed to be open in 2 years. Göttingen, Porto, all Scottish university museums have benefited from major government funding, among so many others. So many of these are very innovative museums with new and larger approaches to collections, knowledge, communities. I used to think that university museums, in my younger days of okay, we need to find the specificity and so on, the niche, our niche, otherwise we cannot compete. But these projects, I tell you, to a great extent, they're doing so much more than the specificity. And they have largely exceeded my expectations because, in a way, University Museums 2.0 looked at the museum sector, collected the best from the museum sector, and made meaningful university-centered synthesis with very uncomfortable collections, facing the problem. Cesare Lombroso, I can explain that. The Cesare Lombroso Museum in Turin. It's something that we shouldn't forget, even in the context of decolonization. So also an important thing that we had in the past decade was, for the first time, there was a university listed as UNESCO World Heritage, which was Coimbra, not for its architecture and art, not like, for example, Caracas, which is World Heritage for a long time, and which is the other one in South America. There are two in South America that have wonderful, UNAM, the National University of Mexico. They are both World Heritage because of the fantastic modernist architecture, or Alcalá de Henares, which is World Heritage due to the legacy of Miguel de Cervantes. But Coimbra was because of its integrated contribution to knowledge, particularly of the 18th century. It's the first time. Also, I think, although UMAC did not have, as far as I know, at least the official UMAC, maybe you did, you never told me. But when I saw in the UNESCO recommendation, 2015, the name collections, I was like, what? So, the title is Recommendation Concerning the Protection and Promotion of Museums and Collections at UNESCO level, their diversity and their role in society. So this is all about, but it has collections. I mean, why would it have collections? I think that it has because we have gradually increased the importance of collections, which is clearly a university specificity. Yeah, I'm just finishing. Also, okay, I don't want to claim, I don't want to be self-aggrandizing in the sense that the community achieve all this, but this document, University Without Walls, of the European University Association, clearly UMAC did not have anything to do with it, or Universium, but when you see culture, there, mentioned so prominently, you can see that there has been a change in universities and the way that they look at heritage and museums. It says clearly, the university is a place where culture is created, performed, exhibited, spread, and discussed. It's a document that I recommend the reading for everyone. Sure, there are many problems. I don't have time to go into that. I will now conclude. I think the story of university museums and collections in the past 20 years demonstrates the power of working together like no other story that I know of. Like a cascade, we have shared our experiences and multiplied our impacts in preservation and universal access of university collections all over the world. And look, even at the height of the crisis, when I was visiting, and even today, when I ask people, yeah, okay, you're complaining, no money, no staff, but would you rather be outside the university? There was not one single answer. Yes, I would like to be in the culture sector or whatever. So, I mean, there's something about being in a university. It's really about being between two worlds and gaining the best of these two worlds. Once university museums learn how to harness to their benefit the universities behind them, the resources, sure, but not only, mostly the people, and especially their values of innovation, creativity, imagination, freedom of thought, avant-garde, but also in an honest way, what makes us humans, such as errors and mistakes. We talked about that yesterday. Fraud, scientific fraud, for example, if we're honest about it, and that makes us humans, there is really something fantastically unique that we can create simultaneously at the global and local levels. Together, I think we created a collective that brought us alternative views about what museums can be, what universities can be, and I'm proud and honored to have been part of it with so many of you. Thank you. So now I go, right?
Thank you, Martha, for this very interesting presentation. Always good to remember where we come from. Merci, et comme nous sommes un duo de présentation, je passe le micro directement à mon collègue Jean-Louis Postillon.
Merci. Bonjour à tous. We now have the pleasure to welcome Dr. Marianne Dôme. Marianne Dôme est la directrice du musée d'histoire, du musée de l'université de Gand, qui a ouvert ses portes il y a 2 ans maintenant. Elle va nous parler de cette institution qui se présente comme un forum pour la science, pour le doute et pour l'art. C'est vraiment un des concepts, je pense, qui sont vraiment intéressants et importants à mettre en évidence dans le cadre de cette réflexion sur le rôle critique des universités et des musées universitaires aujourd'hui. Elle a un diplôme en médecine vétérinaire ainsi qu'un doctorat en anatomie et nous sommes très heureux de l'accueillir aujourd'hui. Please.
This? Yes. Okay. Good morning. Oh, is it on? Yes? Good morning. Wow, you're tall here in Liège, or I'm very small. I'm very small. But thank you for inviting me to come and speak here. Of course, it's very exciting that also Liège is now looking forward to rethinking what to do with the university collections and to build a museum, whether that museum will be a house or will be a concept of managing dispersed collections. That's not clear yet, as I understood. But I want to present here the example of what we chose to do in Ghent, opening the GAM now a year ago. I will mainly focus on the house, on the public face of this university museum, so not on the collection policy. I will talk a little bit about that, but I will mainly try to talk about the genesis of this mission of the house at GAM, the public face of this museum, what we want to represent as a museum. So that's what I want to introduce you to. We call ourselves the Museum of Doubt, and I'm sure, or I hope that by the end of this presentation you will understand why. So, as in Liège, also in Ghent, of course, we have a rich collection, but rich not only in the amount of objects that we represent, but also in the amount of disciplines that are represented in the collections. So these collections are and were dispersed throughout campuses. So they are still dispersed throughout campuses. managed by faculties or departments. But slowly, we are now moving towards a central policy, but not centralized as or embodied in the collections in a central depot yet. We're talking, I'm happy to answer some questions about that, but that's, I think, another story. What I mainly want to say here is that those collections represent a very diverse amount of disciplines. So we talk about the history of science, but also the history of medicine, ethnographic collections, archaeology, veterinary medicine, botany, and so on. So very diverse in disciplines, which makes the Ghent collection, I wouldn't say unique, but it's one of its unique points in the European setting. We also exist 200 years or a bit over 200 years, just like Liège. So those collections were founded by the foundation of the university, by Willem, as you all know, and then grew throughout the years through research or things that were bought or made by researchers themselves, or sometimes also things that were offered by private persons to the collection. So the collection grew and grew. We're talking currently about 400,000 objects that we know of, that are inventorized. 400,000, I'm not talking about the herbarium specimens. We also talked about that. If you also count all those specimens in it, then we're talking about 800,000 specimens. So it's a big collection, it's dispersed, it was managed by different people through different policies. There were some public accessibility, but very little, only on appointment, and lots of those collections were, how I would say, non-active, so not used actively in research or education anymore. That was the case, let's say, roughly 10 years ago. There was one central entity, the History of Sciences, that had a public space on appointment mainly, and a small amount of staff, but they were too small to really implement a policy throughout the university. I think in Ghent, what happened was, and I think it's also a bit what Marta described, was a very bottom-up grown story. Organically throughout the university, different people working on these collections joined each other and started really to bottom-up make the university board aware of these collections, the presence of these collections, but also the potential with these collections in research, in public outreach, and in education. So it's a very grown, bottom-up grown story, this Ghent story. It's not something that came bottom down from the central entity of the university. So a couple of years ago, I would say 10 years ago, the decision was made, there's going to be a university museum. I think roughly within the stage that you're at right now. But what that university museum should be, that was not clear, right? So the task was given back to those same persons to think about what kind of museum do you want to make? And museum, now I'm talking about this public phase, right? A public house. If you build a museum as a space, as a public house, what will your mission be? What do you want to tell to the audience? Belgium does not really have, I think, a tradition in building university museums. Over the last couple of years, there's been Musée, Mons, now Ghent, Leuven is thinking about building one, you're thinking about, so it's a very recent tradition, but at that point, 10 years ago, we did not have an example, there was no tradition, so we also did not have a blueprint, which also gave advances because we had freedom to go and search and make our own museum without any kind of example that we would be compared to also. So I think it was a very happy time for me to go and explore the possibilities of what a museum, a university museum, a science museum could be without any kind of blueprints or restrictions in thinking also. I think very early on in the Ghent story, it became clear that we did not want to build a museum on the history of the university or the history of science. That was very clear from the beginning. The Ghent University motto is Dare to Think, and very early on we already felt like we wanted to connect to this Dare to Think idea or concept, and we wanted to build a museum that was talking about science in itself, science as a cultural phenomenon, science as a way of thinking. So the first thing I explored was maybe not university museums in particular, but the field of science museums, museums that talk about science. Roughly, I would say there, apart from university museums, there are three kinds of museums that I categorized. The natural history museums that focus on natural sciences. They mainly talked about evolutionary biology and are now slowly moving towards climate changes sciences, right? So that's the mission that they want to give to their audience. Roughly, in every natural history museum, you would meet a whale skeleton or a dinosaur skeleton. That's roughly the idea. Then there are the science museums. Science museums mainly focus on science and technology, aim a little bit for me towards the scientism ideas. So they want to give a very positive message about science, and also sometimes quite irrationally position science as some kind of a savior for the future, right? So this is the Science Museum in London, I think. Science, and technology. And then there's the science centers. Science centers don't start from a collection, but they focus on the science is fun principle. Examples in Belgium are Technopolis, the Nemo Museum in Amsterdam, for example. They're quite largely funded, and they are driven by getting children to STEM education. That's mainly what they want to do. But so they don't start from collections, so I don't see them as museums, right? But they play all in the same field. With the Ghent University Museum as a science museum, we wanted to be, position ourselves in this field, but also fill up a niche that maybe was not represented in this sector. So we wanted to add to the sector and not be a copy of one of these kind of concepts. So we position ourselves as part of the museums, as part of the museum sector, with colleagues coming from science museums, but also from other kind of museums. And also as part of our university, although we see ourselves as some kind of a crossover. You can also see that we have our own visual identity. I think that's quite important for us, for the kind of museum that we want to be, that we claim this kind of autonomy towards the outside world, towards how people look at us, or how our audiences look at us. We have to represent this kind of autonomy. We are supported by the university, we are part of the university, but yet we function as a public platform where we allow multiple voices from society to be heard and to give them also a voice. We need to have this kind of autonomous identity and visual identity. So we position ourselves at the crossover. This is how we look like today. So we are based in the Botanical Garden, which is a very big plus, I would say, because the Botanical Garden is free, accessible. It lowers the threshold for people to enter a university campus. It's inviting, because university museums do not underestimate what a high threshold that is for people to enter. So the Botanical Garden helps. They already enter a university campus, they already enter a scientific system without them being aware of it. So Botanical Garden is a very big plus, and is now, I would say, part of the complex, the museum public experience. We are based within a university building, so we are not on the outskirts of the center or on the outside side of the university campus. We are within a campus, and we have no claim over the building, right? So the building is a mixed use. There are classrooms, student classrooms, student classrooms at the first floor, auditoriums, laboratories at the top floor. So we don't have a monoclaim on the building. At first, I thought that was going to be a very difficult position because you need to also guide your audiences towards a museum. Now I see it as a big plus. It's a mix of people who come there and they already meet in a very natural way. So we see students, scientific staff, and our public audience mix in the same building, and that already gives dialogue and confrontation. So we now are using that disadvantage, I think, or trying to use it in a very good way. Yeah. As said, we call ourselves a forum for science, doubt, and art, and it's. I need to explain every word that is written here because it's, I think, important what we stand for. So first of all, we call ourselves a forum, and I think that also links a bit to the new ICOM definition that there's now under a definition of what a museum should be. So as said, we are a place that invites multiple voices, polyphonic space. We are a democratic space, but where we try to lower the threshold to enter and to give voice to people who maybe otherwise are less heard. We are a university museum, so that very high threshold may come across as a bit a dominant voice about science, scientism. That's how people would maybe see us. So we try to constantly lower the threshold and also make it clear that we do not proclaim science, but that we also invite other voices. So that I think this word forum as a democratic place is an inviting place, polyphonic space is a very important word in our baseline. For science, but also for art. So we also show art as a research method, as a research process, next to the scientific one. We show science as the method that gains the most objective knowledge, but we place art next to it as another approach to look at reality and to study reality. And by placing them next to each other, we also show the difference or make the audience feel the difference between those two different methods and their outcome. Doubt, why do we put doubt in there? Because what for me connects the scientific disciplines is the anti-dogmatic thinking. And that's what we constantly try to make clear to everybody who enters the museum, is the importance of anti-dogmatic thinking, of critical thinking. And that's our main mission, I would say. Our main mission is not to be the marketing machine of a university, but to, I don't know why this, but to invite critical citizenship. It's connecting to the main mission also of our own university that wants to deliver critical thinkers to society. That's what the mission of the university states. So we link to that. We try to make the most of our university as the university tries to make the most of us. So critical citizenship, critical thinking, that's mainly what we try to bring across to our audience, nourished, of course, by our collections, so by the academic heritage. We are a museum, so the collection is the basis of everything that we do. We start from the stories, the narratives that are captured within the collection, but the story that we bring across is about scientific thinking and critical thinking. This is the line that we use to communicate we had an external communication bureau helping us to make the campaign, and this is the line that they came across to translate our mission and vision to the public. Welcome inside the head of the scientist. So we focus on what a scientist goes through his or her research. We focus on the process, not on a scientific result, but all the steps that a scientist takes when doing research. That also includes the doubts, the failures, the changing of a hypothesis, throwing away hypothesis, changing ideas. So the scientist is represented as a human being in our museum that is also in doubt sometimes and has an open mind to change ideas. How do we translate that to teams? Because that was also, I think, on the meeting on Monday, that's a difficult question, right? Once you know that's your mission, how do you then translate that to an exhibition? How do you translate that to objects and to teams within an exhibition? Our permanent displays, because we have 2 floors of permanent display, we also have a space for temporary exhibitions. But so the permanent display, we have divided into these themes: chaos, doubt, model, measure. I would say those first themes really focus on the scientific method. And then the second floor, the themes are imagination, knowledge, and network. And those focus more on science in the societal context, science in relation to society, to industry, to art, and so on. So those first 4 themes start from chaos, which mainly focus on classification systems. So we talk about why do scientists use classification systems, but we also immediately put those into context, because those classification systems, they change. They're not rigid thinking models, they change throughout time, and they are only to be used within that certain context. So as soon as we put something across as a theme and as something that an audience would maybe, if they had preliminary ideas about science and scientific thinking, and think that scientists use classification system in a very rigid way, we immediately try to challenge those preliminary ideas of the audience. The 3, let's say, take-home messages, the mission statements are written down here, and they are interwoven throughout the whole display. So if these are not explicitly mentioned anywhere in the display, but if the visitor would read all the texts or would go through the exhibition, in the back of their mind, this is what we want them to take home as a message about science. Science is a dynamic concept, so science is not a system that exists and does not evolve throughout time or does not connect to society. It's science is in direct contact with the cultural system within a society and interacts with it. So it's not a rigid concept, it's a dynamic concept. Science is a human activity practiced by humans, so that means that it's also challenged by politics, by doubt. We all know the academic world, there's competition and so on. It's not something that is outside of humanity, it's within humanity, for humanity, but it's a human activity. So it also is prone to mistakes and so on. And science implicates dare to think. Scientists have to be creative. It's not about rigid thinking, it's about creative thinking. So I think here we display the scientists and science in a very transparent way to our audiences. We show it in its vulnerable position, but we also open the dialogue with our visitors about what science is, what science should be. So we don't proclaim or don't give a one-direction information transfer to our audiences, but we try to evoke a lot of questions and search together with the visitor what science is exactly and what it isn't. I've tried to place some examples. I don't know why this is all shifted, but I've tried to place some examples of how we translate that to objects. For example, here you will see a classification of flies collected by a forensic pathologist in his study to estimate the time of death of victims. So he collected and classified all these little flies that were represented on bodies, right? So what you see here is that this classification system it shows, or the objects in itself already shows some kind of a vulnerability, because you can easily displace these flies, which he probably did. You can also see how he made little pinholes and changed it. So a classification system is not a fixed idea. Also, this classification system of flies does not apply somewhere else in the world. So every classification system has its own context in which it works. And it also always should be challenged to be used in other contexts. Or this series of wax models of the development of the genital system. Also, that kind of classification system, there's a biological classification of gender, which is very useful to doctors in medicine, to know whether you're XX or XY, but we also know now in society that there's a more fluid classification of gender. So the XX and XY does not define you as a human being. So classification is variable within the context that it's used in. Or measuring the skull was once interpreted as in a phrenological system, and now has been contested and is or completely disregarded, which does not mean that these kind of hypotheses at that time were completely ridiculous. So it's making hypotheses and changing throughout time with different insights is a never-ending story in science. That's what we try to show. Here are some more examples of our visual identity. I think it also shows how we search this equilibrium between science, art, doubt. It attracts also another kind of audience, I would say, than maybe the classical natural history museum visitor. As you can see, for now, our logo is always next to the university logo, but it's always combined. So we have our own logo and then the logo of the university. In our scenography, and how do we want to make people feel when they come inside this museum? We want them to feel beauty. That's what I would say as first. Wonder, yes, but also we want them to have an aesthetic experience. Maybe an experience that people do not expect in a science museum. So we want them to go and explore themselves. It's not, but I connect a lot of science museums to a lot of noise, very bright lights, and so on. So what we are doing is making it more a place of contemplation. It's also important, I think, for me to connect to a museum as a place of contemplation where we join in a dialogue, but where there's also room to go into in this introspective thinking paths, right? So our lights, the lights in our museum are very damped. Wonder, but also beauty. It's another example. You can also see here, and that's something else I wanted to talk about, how we juxtapose these different disciplines next to each other. So we do these themes that we use, chaos, doubt, measurement, imagination, they allow to show different disciplines, scientific disciplines next to each other. We are not the museum of the hard sciences or the natural sciences, but of all scientific disciplines. So we also represent humanities, social sciences. And in order to do that, and to not make one room for archaeology and one room for physics, we juxtapose objects from these different disciplines next to each other, which challenges also the visitor to search what it is exactly that connects these, why are these objects placed in the theme of imagination. So juxtaposition is an important tool in our museum to evoke reflection in the visitor. Every theme is represented by what we call a key table. So this is the table in which we display 8 objects in every theme. 8 objects, always selected from humanities to the hard sciences. We paid very careful attention to that every branch of the sciences is represented in each theme. And then next to the key tables, there are these cabinet displays where we show the diversity, the richness of the collection, and we invite the visitor more to go and explore themselves. Multi-perspectivism is also a very important key word in our mission or in our approach, I would say, in our approach of our subjects, in our approach of the themes, in our approach of science, and so on. So each object, each theme, we try to look at from different perspectives, from different disciplines, from different kind of audiences, and so on. So this is already what I talked about. Juxtaposition is a way to allow this multi-perspectivism, but also to evoke a reflection in the visitor. Multi-perspectivism is also implemented by inviting artists to come and to come and work for us in commission, or to show their work, or even maybe to expand now our collection. We have been donated artworks very recently. So we have recently been, also the question has been risen, should we also extend our collection towards art, right? I think this was a very important statement when we opened. We opened with a very big street art wall by Roa. He's an international renowned street artist coming from Ghent. But so even when the visitor walks into in the museum or walks on the campus, the museum campus, he or she already sees this big art piece entering the museum. So it's already, yes, there is artistic freedom in the anatomy of the skeletons. There are mistakes, it's the artistic interpretation, I would say. It's not the exact anatomy. In our temporary exhibition, exhibitions. This is the first one that opened. Recently there has been a new one opened now. So this is the temporary exhibition space, which we call the gallery. In the temporary exhibitions, we always invite contemporary artists to also go into dialogue with these themes and to show either new work or existing work. And we also do loans with art museums to juxtapose art next to the scientific objects. So finding the dialogue with the arts is important to us. We are now trying to set up also this kind of artist in residence systems. So we are exploring how we can, as a museum, play a role in connecting the university and science to art. I will skip this one. It's going to lead me too far. I think also an important step in the whole build-up of the museum was defining our target audiences. Who are we doing this for? It does not mean that you have to change the key message that you want to give. I think we mainly diversified how we communicate to these different target audiences, but we really paid a lot of time and energy in defining who are we talking to. So if we write texts, who are we sending them to? Is it the right tone of voice? Are we using the right platforms? And also in the museum text, who should we address? So our main target audience, who we speak to in our museum text, so on display, I would say are the students of higher education and the secondary school students, so 18 to 25-year-olds. That's our tone of voice in the museum texts. Those are the main ones we try to reach. Of course, next to that, we do see ourselves as part of the university, so the academic staff, student associations, and so on. Of course, very important target groups, but we reach them with different channels or different communication channels. The science lovers and the museum lovers. I mean, Ghent is a museum city. There are 10 museums in the smaller city of Ghent. The cultural and museum lover in Ghent is widely represented, so we also, of course, want to invite them in. And we think on city level, but also on the level of Flanders, Belgium, and why not internationally. So that's, we communicate to all these different target groups in a different way. We are a forum of interaction and participation, and as said, our students are our main target audience, and we want to let them participate. I think I only have 5 minutes left, but I really want to represent our MUST team. The MUST team is the museum student team. We invited them 3 years before opening, so we selected a group of 30 students out of 80 candidates. We did an open call. And they come from different disciplines, and they are first bachelor's to PhD students, so quite diverse. And they are our young board, but also our young voice. So when I was talking about museum text, for example, we had 3 different editing bureaus making offers to edit our museum text. They choose which editing board we would go along with. So they are our young board. They are, for us, the young voice that is brought into the museum, and we know they represent our target audience. What do we give in return? In return, we give them, for example, training in storytelling. They chose their favorite object, and created a story around it. We had a real storytelling coach come over and train them in talking to an audience, and then we made a must-see tour during the opening month. So they went and stood next to their favorite objects, and people could address them, and they talked all about it. So we had a must-see tour, which was widely appreciated by the audience. They were trained as students in talking to audiences. So it's always this kind of a win-win game. On different levels, this temporary exhibition that I already showed you, that the design of the display, so the scenography, was done by the students of architecture in a 1-year program. 15 students worked on that for 1 year. So there's different kind of connections to students, either through educational programs, internships, or as a MUST member. I only have 5 minutes left or less now, so I'm going to skip a bit through some slides. The slides mainly want to show you that we have a diverse program to reach all those different kind of target audiences. So it's almost custom made, I would say, to each. I don't know, it's blocked. custom-made almost to each different target audience, whether they're families, students, high school students, and so on. So we have a diverse program custom-made on the head of the target audience. Of course, we don't stay in the museum alone. We also go outside, certainly during the COVID times. So we send guides, for example, to classrooms. This in particular was to Okan Plus. Okan classes are newcomers in Belgium who don't speak the language just yet. So we try to use signs and the objects, the collection, as a universal language to also try and reach those classes. And afterwards, they came with their families into the museum. So we see the youth as our main target audience, but also the youth as a representative of society in the future and as a connection to the diversity of the city and of the population. Yeah, this I will skip. Maybe I think mainly what I still wanted to show you was maybe our challenges or first results. It's also important, I think. So I said main target audience is youth. After a year, so been a year open right now, I can tell you that 38% of our ticket sells to minus 26-year-olds. I would say that's quite successful. We position ourselves within the cultural sector and the museum sector of Ghent. We are now formally included in all the platforms and there's a big board, a museum board in Ghent. We are also represented there. So we are formally recognized, I would say, as one of the Ghent museums. This is the number just last week. So after being open for 1 year, also, of course, under the restriction of every rule of COVID, we have invited 53,000 people, roughly. So those are individual visitors. And we've only been allowed to have school groups since September, but of course they came only mid-September, October. So in the month of October, we had 300 school groups already. So we are fully booked for schools and groups throughout October and November also already. What are our challenges? And I would say those are also take-home messages for here to think about opening a university museum. This positioning within the university and how to connect to the sector, the museum sector, and to the university itself, that remains a challenge. It's a constant challenge, and it's not going to end anytime soon. It's also an interesting position to be in. So at the moment, we have a scientific committee that was already involved, of course, in the building of the museum, and the faculties are represented there, and some more local scientists. So we have a scientific committee. For me, they are our main connections also to the research community of the Ghent University. We call them the GAM antennas. They are our ambassadors within the university. So we selected them not only on their expertise, or on their scientific discipline, but also on how do they feel our mission and vision. Will they be the ambassador within their faculty for the museum? Will they see opportunities for us to collaborate, and so on? So this is a very important organ to connect to the university. The advisory committee is composed of people from the museum sector, together with university people. So those two external organs, those two external organs, they really feed us, and they will, I think, define our position in the coming years. Financing is also not an easy one. We are at the moment solely financed by the university. we all know that that only depends on how the relationship with the rector is, and the rector is to be re-elected in so many years. So the relationship with the rector and so on is important. I directly, at the moment, have to go, or how to say that, report to the rector. So we are a new an entity that falls directly under the rector, which I think is important. But this relationship is depends on who sits in that chair, of course, and also being solely financed is not it's not a safe position, I would say. So we're looking for other funding. Currently, or up till now, we were not allowed to apply for subsidies at the Flemish government level. Universities in Flanders were excluded to go for subsidies on the level of Flanders. The last couple of, last 3 years, the Flemish Inter-University Board, VLIG, so Leuven, Ghent, Hasselt, Antwerp, Brussels, have joined together in a working group. And we have finished this document on academic heritage in Flanders, and we use it to go and change the policy at the level of the Ministry of Culture. Only last month we've broken up the legislation, which means that from next year on, we as universities will also be able to get funding from Flanders, which at least will give us two possibilities for funding. So important. I think this is a very important step. Okay, I think I will round up and my time is up. But I'd be happy to answer questions at the Q&A later on.
Thank you very much, Marianne, for sharing with us this very inspirational experience. I think we all really want to go to Ghent and see this museum by ourselves, so thank you very much. Nous allons maintenant avoir un moment d'échange avec nos deux oratrices du matin, mais avant ça, on propose une petite pause, à la salle des professeurs. On se retrouve à 11h pour discuter tous ensemble pour les questions et puis les conclusions de la journée. Merci beaucoup.
Yeah.
Le temps de questions, du débat est venu, donc il y aura un micro dans la salle qui circulera, mais peut-être que je vais d'abord demander à nos deux intervenants de ce matin si elles ont questions, réactions, l'une par rapport à l'autre.
I have.
Mais que je peux parler français?
Oui, bien sûr. Emma, je peux parler mix. Je vais parler mix de français et anglais. Well, I wanted to say that I think that this gun example is really, I mean, you're here in Liège. It's like, I don't know, 2 hours and a half, 3 hours. It's really a place to go. It demonstrates my idea of general approach that many of these university museums 2.0 are having. I'm very much looking forward to see what's happening in Utrecht, also near you, Bergen, and so on. And so I think that this is really genius. I mean, these small examples that Marianne gave, I mean, the students' board, it's absolutely fantastic. C'est génial. The antennas, the small thing, apart from, you know, the approach to the exhibition. I think that they have really good solutions for many of the problems that we feel everywhere. And it's worth trying, it's worth knowing, it's worth networking. So that's what I would, at this point, advise everyone.
Thank you.
Thank you. I also have to say that, of course, we're still like experimenting, and these this antenna idea, that's an idea that I want to implement now. Whether it works or not, I don't know. But the big advantage of university network and the university museum network is that we should be able to share these experiments with each other, what works, what doesn't work.
Yeah.
Because whether a university is in Italy or in Belgium or whatever, they all work the same.
Yeah.
Academics, it's a breed. So we should share these kind of ideas.
And you have already results, because when you have 40% of youngsters, school groups separated, okay? So that's very important. School groups separated. Almost 40% of youngsters. I think this is incredible for any museum. You know, in 2005 or 4, the Science Museum in London, in order to cater for this youth target, had to open a sushi bar. Okay, they had to open a sushi bar inside the museum to have youngsters come and stay, you know. So it's a very difficult constituency. I think even yesterday Boris talked about this group, this age group, which is exactly the age group of our university students. Think about it, you know. It's a group that doesn't visit museums. They will only come back to the museum once they have children or families and so on. So it's an incredible result. So that this is an important result that you're already achieving. So yes, it's an experiment. We're all experimenting, but you're already communicating your results to the community. So that's a very good thing.
Thank you.
Oui.
Peut-être avant de donner la parole à la salle, Martha, je voulais vous demander, vous nous avez bien fait comprendre l'importance pour un réseau comme UMAC d'associer la notion de collection universitaire avec celle de musée. Les collections universitaires qui sont le socle finalement qui permet de construire le discours sur la critique, sur le doute au sein du musée universitaire dans cette spécificité-là. Vous savez probablement qu'en dans la muséologie générale, le rôle des collections est parfois remis en question au sein des musées, et donc je me demandais, pourrait-on imaginer un musée universitaire sans collection préexistante, sans une histoire longue de recherche et de collection, d'acquisition? Est-ce que ça existe un musée universitaire de ce type-là?
Je pense, not diminishing the relevance of your question. I think it's more important to think of not of a museum without collections, but collections without a museum. And I think that although the university museum became unnatural, and intrinsèque to the activities of the university in the mid-20th century, collection never stopped, really. So collections continue to be generated. And in fact, that is one of the problems that we have in universities today, which is how to patrimonialiser. En fait, c'est un des thèmes de ce colloque, comment patrimonialiser. Because even if you consider a museum, like, okay, we built a museum, it's fantastic. You have to deal in a university, which is always changing. Not only you have to reinvent your museum every day, but you have to think about how to patrimonialiser le présent. So everything that is being generated every day in university, in each university, and how to do that, and how to think of okay, we have a backlog, we have to deal with this, but then we also have to deal with, otherwise we cannot be, we're gonna die, eventually. So yes, there are many collections. I hope to see some of the collections with you later here in, which are not, I don't like the term patrimonialiser so much. I prefer institutionaliser, because they may not be patrimonialized yet, but they are already institutionalized. For example, under the chapeau of the pole, for example, they're considered. Okay, we've noticed them, we acknowledge them, they exist, they're not abandoned, they're not orphaned, we don't have time, we don't have resources, but they're listed. And so that's a very important thing. So institutionalization is the first step towards a patrimonialization, which could happen with a museum. The museum is more like a tool. But in fact, the real unit, the atom of all these things are the collections that are generated daily. But yeah, of course, there are museums without collections. And in fact, at the time of the crisis, I remember when we were talking to rectors used to love, not so much, but used to love science centers, okay? So the idea of a science center, right? Isn't it true? Every rector loved to have a science center in a university. But how to connect that with the collections? No idea. In fact, it didn't really connect in the minds of the people. It's a different thing, but it's an approach without collections. I'm glad we are away from that kind of idea. We will probably get back to the no museum without collections through intangible heritage. I think we will getting close. We're getting close in these new projects to an idea of intangible heritage, of the practices, of the savoir-faire, and all that. We're very close to that. So I think we need to do more research and consolidate a little bit, students, consolidate a little bit the concepts of heritage that are behind, but I'm glad we're far away from this idea. In fact, we're the opposite, because you remember science centers is just, it's fiat, it's science as fiat, as something, the concept is given, is dogmatic, and the approach is totally the opposite in these new projects. I don't know if I answered. I kind of complexified a little bit.
Thank you very much.
Thank you. Je m'ennuie en adressant la sorte d'une certaine façon. Est-ce qu'il peut exister une université sans collection? Je pense que ça rejoint le projet de Jean Mignon. Je pense que les collections. Ah, il y en a qui auraient. Je parlais il y a 10 minutes avec un professeur, il en rêvait. Mais bon. Et ici à l'Université de Liège, nous avons un musée universitaire presque sans collection. C'est la restauration. Il y a des collections, mais elles ne sont pas dans l'ADN de la restauration. Je me contredis si je dis des bêtises, mais l'approche de la restauration, c'est l'approche de la découverte, à Paris, c'est pas fondé sur des collections.
Ça va être une pièce scientifique.
Quoi?
Ça va être une pièce relativement baisse pour l'instant.
Je pense qu'il est temps de donner la parole à la fin. Alors, Denis?
Martin, my friend, it's a fantastic examples that you gave of universities. Really, I would appreciate it. One which normally I not always recommend was, all the work you have obviously done on even the name of the museum, on the logo, on the graphics, and I find it's extremely successful. And by my experience, often when you work with graphics, especially in logo and this sort of stuff, often it's very disappointing, and so on. So I wanted to know if there were students, if you work, how you work with them, how you need to choose both title, logo, graphic. How was it your initiative, was it collective?
Oh no, the initiative definitely came from the museum, not from the university. So it was a negotiation that went on for years, whether or not we would use the logo and the visual identity of the university, or that we would get our own. Maybe I have to explain a little bit before the GOM opened, or even the name existed, but during the 10 years that we were aware that it was opening, in order to establish also a network within the city and with other museums within the city, we did several temporary exhibitions and projects with the collection and with the other museums. So before we had a place, we had temporary exhibitions in collaboration within city museums. And of course, that also we had to communicate without a name, but as a collection of the university. And some of those projects also had an own graphic design. And we started to play with an own identity, how autonomous are we, are connected to the university. So first of all, I want to say that this trajectory with the city museums was very important also to us for now, how we position ourselves in the city, and to be autonomous and to be appreciated as a museum by the other museums. And this whole contest or exercise in graphic identity was part also of becoming a museum and becoming a house, I would say, and it was along the way, we had a lot of discussions with the communication department of the university. So at a certain point, we had I didn't talk about the slide of the whale of the cathedral, but that was a big project that had a lot of attention. And the project was called Out of the Box and had an own visual identity. I appointed a graphic designer outside of the university because the university didn't want to support financially. So I did it on my own. But all of a sudden, this was quite a successful story with an own graphic identity. And so the communication department was really not happy with me at that point. But it also opened the discussion with them at that point to, where are we going to be as a visual graphic identity? And over the course of the years, I think they started to appreciate that it was important to have an own visual identity, also in order to not to come across as a marketing machine of the university. Because being a university, being a museum, like I said in my talk, do not underestimate how high that threshold is for people to come in. So to lower the threshold, I think it's important to really be an identity apart yet connected to the university. And you do that very much with your name and with the graphic identity. And now we get, the positive feedback on the design. I can say it here because it's one of me and it's secret. But next week it will be announced that we have probably a full design prize with the house style. A house style, and it's also very positive feedback from the university. Now they're happy.
was contains more like your way of introducing them. And I find it's what we have been discussing before. I find it's really extraordinary illustration.
Thank you.
D'autres questions? La salle?
It's not really a question, it's more a comment. Just to say how happy I was to hear both of you. And for Marianne, especially happy because it's much in tune with what we want to do in the age. And it's about the science of process, not focusing very much on the result of the process. Science as a journey, and also thematizing doubt as a normal, if not a necessary step in the scientific process. That's very much what we want to do. There's a narrative I want to create a lot of the image. So we have a lot of experience, and I look forward to visiting India. So really, thank you. It was really what we waited for this discussion, what we want and what we wish to have during this sport. Very, very much thanks for that. So, thank you.
May I say that yesterday, when I heard you, I turned to Sébastien and said, you know, they have it. They have it here. You've been thinking about the same things. So this, you talked about adventure, you talked about the narrative, you talked about the process. So it's really about translating to the stories that are here from Liège. So we all have to do the same thing, is to tell the truth, so to speak, of our objects. And sometimes they're shameful, sometimes they're uncomfortable. Sometimes I always think of, and I would like to mention here, because it's an homage that I always try to do, and it's also another place to go, which is the Cesare Lombroso collection, which was a donation. You know, Cesare Lombroso, one of the eugenists, died in 1910, I think, or 1909. So really, a guy who created those types, those human types. And he was from Turin, and he gave the collection for the university. His whole life achievement, everything. So the drawings, the all the knives, because he was trying to, associate with criminals, the morphology and all that. So the knives, the prisons, the time he spent in prisons, and with mental ill persons in hospitals and so on. All that incredible collection that was given to the University of Turin in order to create a museum, which was opened. After the First World War, and then closed. And the whole collection was packed, boxed, and stored in the attic, because the university didn't know what to do with it. Because it forced the university to confront with their own past. Until there was a guy, wonderful, one of my heroes, Professor Giacomo Giacobini, with lots of connections to France. He's professor of human anatomy at the Collège de France and so on, who thought, no, what we have is really extraordinary. We have the material evidence of a story that we could tell. And so they opened the museum in 2000, to a lot of controversy, but that kind of controversy of people who had not been there. A museum, Cesare Lombroso, to what? To celebrate the life of Cesare Lombroso. There were petitions to close the museum, but people who never, and I think this is a good controversial, because again, puts all museums in the media and so on. But in fact, it's a museum that really looks at the truth of those collections and assumes it. Fraud, he manufactured numbers. The context of Italy, the context of Europe at the late 19th century. So it's we have to do this. We have to be truthful to the stories. We cannot tell other stories with the objects, So it goes to what you were saying. There's one thing about one thing is starting from the object and looking at the story of the object. The other thing is you have a story to tell and you illustrate with the objects. It's a totally different thing. And the latter is what we are used to do. Much more. Also historians, you know, as when they use sources, material sources. What we have to do is much more the first, but for that we need resources to do research on the history of collections and to have, you know, because we cannot, we have to really find out what it's all about.
A short reminder I'd like to add. It was yesterday from a museum university was an astronaut, a kind of dancer, so was the university before. It's the research from the university. It's the provocative, exactly what I can learn. And when we did, I have to do with the resources of the national needs, I also think that we have probably to work closely with the top researchers in the university, because it's also where the money can be found. If we can integrate them and invite them to join this museum process and to show them how useful it can be, to have this opportunity to show how they do, how they do the results they can achieve, and how it can be put in perspective with other disciplines and other fields of science. That would be a win-win situation. And it's also the place, especially for big projects, they only can have a small line with the budget dedicated to what we do in the museum. So for the financial resources, it's probably too neglected, but it's probably a good source.
Yes. Without wanting, can I react to that too? But very briefly, without wanting to monopolize. There's already the outreach item, okay, in projects. What we're trying to do in this infrastructure that we have in Portugal, but we didn't achieve anything, is every project, scientific project that generates collections, like tissues, whatever, new collections, but also equipment, scientific equipment that later will become obsolete, there is a percentage, like for the outreach, that is allocated to museums like the GAM and my museum, or Strasbourg, or whatever, who can really put those collections accessible. So I think that would be a very nice thing if we unite ourselves in having, generating projects, generating collections, must be paid. It's like the polluter must pay. Why should the university then later on, 20 years later, have no financial means, no staff, no, it needs to be planned from the beginning, like outreach. That's a consensus, everyone uses outreach, sorry.
I just wanted to add, connect to the research, yes, connect, I just think we need to be careful that we do not just connect to the outreach, but that we connect also to the core mission of what a university should do, which is empower critical citizenship, right? That's what we want to do with our students, that's also what we want to do in society. And a museum can play a perfect role in that. So not just outreach, I'd say. The other thing I wanted to add to be transparent and truthful, it's also one of the key elements if you want to address these young audiences. The new generations, they do not accept, rightfully so,
blah, blah, blah.
Blah, 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 blah. They want, it's the woke generations, so they want us to be transparent and truthful, and they want to have a voice in what's being shown and how we display it. So, be truthful and transparent. Exactly.
Now I would like to come back to your project, to your museum, and now it's open. I would like to question your relationship. How, because you present, how do you feel your position is between the university, the city, and outside and inside, and that's very important. We just have this exchange, and you pointed out that it's not an outreach, it's something else, also university museum. So it should be understood as something more than just an outreach or global window to the city. You presented at the end not at the end, but at some point, I started working on the presentation, there were this graph where you talk about the scientific committee and so on. My question generally is now, what is your relationship with the university in general, but also the scientists, the actor, the research, the person, not only the scientists, the technicians also. Do you ever also do that? Do they come to the museum? Do they want to be partner and do something with the museum? That's one point. Because I have a feeling that you also have the opportunity to do your project, discuss it, of course, with the scientific committee, legitimate scientific things, to discuss it with, and sometimes it was not easy with the governance of the university, but you have some kind of autonomous. Because at some point you succeed to convince them that you have the legitimacy to do the project and to have the answers to their questions or to put in shape the whole idea and the whole concept of the university is doing. So I don't know if you see where I want to go, but it's very important to question the role of the museum and the legitimacy of the museum, but not in the also in its direction, but also in the legitimacy of the professional of the museum towards scientists, towards scientific knowledge, and so on.
It's a very good question, and we're still in the midst, I think, of that whole. I can be very stubborn, and it's very important to safeguard your mission once it's there. And it's very easy to be approached by scientists who see you as an outreach platform. And I think now, the next coming years, and I already notice it now, it's about being stubborn and not being used as the outreach platform. And I see slowly, that we are being approached more as a research partner. I see the shift happening. And I think it's important to keep being stubborn. And they see the museum, the setting, as a phenomenon, a culture that needs to be studied. They see it as a place to study audience interaction with science. They see it as a platform to collect data for citizen science projects. So all these kind of questions, they start to emerge now, and there's, I think, an important shift. And that also demands from us to constantly activate the antennas, and also to address researchers with questions by us, not just to wait for them to come to us with questions, but we address them. So, for example, for the next temporary exhibition, there will be, which is called Phallus Norm and Form. We've addressed in the scientific committee for that exhibition a couple of research groups that we wanted to involve, not only to check on the scientific content, but also because we wanted to let them see the exhibition as an opportunity to start research and also to start research projects, to have master thesis students doing literature reviews. But mainly what I wanted to say is that when it's opening in March, there will be 2 points in that exhibition where we're going to collect data from visitors that then will be processed by those researchers that will flow to academic research. So they start to see opportunities, to see us as research partners. And I think that's a big shift from outreach platform to, the museum is also
scientific instrument.
A scientific instrument, but also a catalyzer of...
And then when you have that identity consolidated, you can actually do outreach again. It's kind of, you can do it. You can also do it.
Yeah, but I think it's very, very easy to step into the pitfall of being that platform. And because every week we've got tons of questions of researchers, do poster exhibitions.
Poster
and you
exhibitions,
can fill your
exactly.
time and you can.
That's their idea of
I know.
Exactly.
So it's very
It can be
easy.
different thing if you control, if you control, if the museography, if the museology is in your, we do it, but we control the communication, the means, when it's done, the calendar, and so on. So I think it can be done.
But maybe not just now. No. We're just too young and new, and it's very...
And too flexible.
Yes, it's important that we form our own identity first, and then, but yeah.
What about teaching?
Teaching, but what I also see the shift now is, so there's still collection being used as teaching material, but more in the hard sciences, I would say. And now I see teachers from the humanities coming to the museum and looking at the museum as a phenomenon, as a cultural space, as art and science dialogue. I mean, last week I taught classes in the humanities, not in the hard science, and also that is a shift. Recently.
Yeah, that's fantastic.
Yeah.
Okay.
So, good morning. Thank you very much. Congratulations to both of you for your presentations. Parabéns, Marco. I have two questions. To Marco, I want to ask if you can share with us a little bit about the project in your museum, about provenance, because it's very contemporary and most of the institutions are worried about this and do investments to research. But in Germany, for example, it's something like everyone and you have a very ambitious process that I follow with most news like it's almost finished in 5 years, so I'd like to know how we will reach 2 million of pieces. And so, Mara, I'd like again to thank you for exchanging our students in theology, and we had a great time visiting the museum in April. And I'd like to ask you about another more complex thing, because you talked about multimodality, and yesterday we heard about interculturalism, because interdisciplinarity, I think is very clear that the museums should work on. But interculturality is more complex, especially in university museum, because university always has this point of view that has keep a knowledge that is above the others knowledge. And I come from a country, for example, Brazil, where we are learning a lot of information about medicine, about the environment, development of environment, management, and the university starts to give the kind of more scout, for example, for natives and people that doesn't have a bachelor's degree. But I don't know how university museums can deal with these other visions of work, other epistemology, at the same time taking care of what we got from the scientific research. So if it's possible to give that change also about the academic knowledge.
It's a difficult one. I would say we support doubt within the scientific process. We do not doubt science as a process, right? That's very important that is clear from the beginning, and that's also our mission. To have polyphony, so to invite different kind of voices in our program, absolutely. And that's also an important reason why we target those secondary high schools, because lots of those children who come in would otherwise not need science or need university or sometimes even a museum. And so we set up programs that we don't only get those pupils in, but also that they bring their families. So to really, you have to actively address those communities to get them in, because otherwise, I mean, we pay a lot of attention and we put a lot of energy to do that. That's really within our mission. So we want to give them a voice, and we want to go into a dialogue with them, but that does not mean that we will state that science is under doubt, right? So I think it's important that you can as a science museum, that you're active in supporting science and scientific thinking and scientific method without being dogmatic or being supportive of scientism. I mean, there's a difference there. Yeah.
It's a very good question. So basically what you ask is how we're dealing with the decolonization in our museum, which is something that we've been doing in the past 5 years. We inherited the institute, the major institute, research institute of governmental colonial research, which had the colonial collections of the missions, a bit like, but it was never a museum. So not like Trevoeren here, but more like the institute in the Netherlands. What was its name? No, not the museum. The institute that handled the colonial, anyway, it doesn't matter, it'll come to me. So we inherit that in 2015. Big colonial collections, so a little bit before the whole discussion. But we started the provenance research. I could be here until midnight talking about that, but I will only say two things. The first is that finished the provenance, and so I started in September talking about it. Okay, now I know what's happening, and what I found out, I found three major clusters, which I would love to share with you, of problems that usually are not addressed in the guidelines. So in particular, cartography, raw data of cartography, which is never mentioned, maybe in the decolonizing of archives, maybe, I don't know, so, but that we have it. We have the raw data of the survey, the map surveys of Angola, Mozambique. I mean, why do we have that? Basically, that's the question. Then there's another cluster of blood, so not so much human remains and bones, but we have samples of blood, 16,000, in cartons, okay, blood. That's a major problem. I don't know what to do with that. And also a collection of photography that are absolutely too disgusting to describe. And for me, it changed me when I saw them, okay? And so we're having now a discussion about that. That's why I appeared publicly, and we're starting to have that transparency, truthfulness, and hearing everyone. It's not been easy to hear the representatives of the communities, I'll tell you that. So we need to find somebody to talk to. I would say that easy. But for the general, university collections implications, okay? I think that we have a major problem with the decolonizing the university in terms of the collections, because they are outside museums, especially medical collections and the physical anthropology collections. They are outside museums, so they are not under any ICOM code of ethics, so you cannot really force, not that you can force in a university, but anyway, you have no framework to say, all right? So I think that that's a major problem that we have to think about. We have some other ethical issues that I think it's too complicated to explain here, but I'll be delighted to talk to you.
To follow the idea of no framework, yes, when they are not museum, they are not obligated to follow the test codes, the code of the test of the item. But we have the recommendation of the in 2015 about museum and collection that I think is
good point.
A kind of
yes.
Collection.
Yes, because it's established relations with indigenous peoples and so on. And there's also the UNESCO Declaration of Indigenous Peoples, which is 2007, I think. It's also very important. But yeah, but there's no direct, you see what I mean, from the museum world saying what to do. And it's important to have those documents. So maybe we should get together and write some guidelines about decolonizing collections in the European universities especially.
As I was listening to you, I was wondering whether collections and storage rooms are not somehow amalgamated in university museums. And I was wondering whether you're going to make a difference between collections, what you offer to the public, and then a third layer somewhere, the storage rooms. Because it seems like in very many universities, the collections which are there, as you said, suddenly turn out to be storage rooms, and you keep digging or tapping into the collections as if they were storage rooms. So how have you been able to make, a 3-layer floor or 3-story floor structure now that you are building a museum?
Very good question.
Yeah, I'm not sure I understand completely. The difference between collections and storage rooms.
You have, in other words, you said, you have storage rooms.
Storage rooms, okay. So first of all, I want to say, I've said it at the beginning of my presentation, I've now focused on the public face of the museum, but for me, the collection, of course, are the basis of everything. That's, a museum without a collection. Okay, so I think the public face, or what you tell that with the collection is something very volatile in a way. It will change every so many years. The collection is the basis, and that's what keeps, that's the heritage, and that's what keeps a long time. To have a central kind of storage space or depot is in a way, I'm still not sure what the good exercise is within the university to leave it throughout campuses where it's sometimes activated, but sometimes also endangered. So we are now in the current state, we are first of all doing the inventory, because we are more visible, we also are announced or more aware of hidden collections, of course. And then we make a decision whether it's endangered or not. If it's not endangered, then we do the inventory, that we know that it's there, and we have the mandate to
take care of it.
To take care of it, yeah.
But you leave it in place.
If it's not endangered, and certainly if it's active in research or education, of course we do it. But we make a central inventory, for sure. If it's endangered, if we think either the department is not interested in it anymore, or it's the conservatory circumstances are not well, then we try also to centralize it. We are currently building a central depot in the southern floors of the museum. So there are 2 floors beneath the museum. One floor will be a central depot where we will put the archaeology, zoology, ethnographic collections, history of medicine, so a lot of those non-active endangered collections will come in the central depot, and then apart from the dispersed active collections, we also have outside of the city center another kind of depot for the more, let's say, the very big objects and the less vulnerable objects, big like concrete presses and so big objects. So the -2 will be a central depot, -1 will be a workshop room. A workshop room where we want to reactivate those collections within the academic community. So there will be a workshop room where people or teachers from all kinds of disciplines can come and do practical exercises with collections, or where researchers can consult objects, right? So, and that was kind of a struggle because space is always very, but I really wanted to safeguard the -1 as a way to interact with the collection as an academic community. And of course you lose storage space too, but so -2 will be non-accessible for public researchers, -1 will be the consultation, reading room of the collection, let's say. And I mean, again, that will demand from us to actively speak towards teachers to come and see this new higher state workshop room where people do workshops with students or secondary and high school students, I don't know. But so -1 will be the consultation room and the central.
I love the term reactivate. No, I really do. It reminds me of the Cinderella. The first ever survey, I forgot to mention that. It was not the UK, not the Netherlands. It was Australia who did the first ever survey of their university heritage, we would call it now. And the title of the survey was called Cinderella Collections, in the sense that they would receive a kiss and they were dormant and then they would be reactivated. I like that metaphor very much. I think that you should go to another level, okay? I dare you to think, which is instead of storage for archaeology, paleontology, the collection and so on, let's have a storage for the imagination collections, the chaos collections, did you think about that?
I'm not sure the collection manager will be very happy organized thematically.
It would be wonderful, wouldn't it?
But the nice thing is that you can go from the museum, there's a stairs, and then there's of course a door, but you can really go downstairs also to the
But there's a dissonance, you see what I mean? You come from the museum and it's chaos, imagination, and so on. And then you come, it's archaeology, and so on. But again, as if there's some kind of cognitive. You see what I mean?
Yeah, I don't see them categorized per discipline, but per material.
Yeah,
right?
okay.
So, and even in the material, because our zoologist is already going, no, I'm going to completely disrupt my system because I want taxonomy. No, it's going to be material.
And it's important for our research too, that they organize taxonomy. But I would love to go back to my museum. And say, pardon. I would love to get back. Okay, now I heard this about the government, and we're going to get ourselves organized into chaos collections, imagination collections, courage. Wasn't it? No, courage was not courage. Knowledge. Our knowledge, that's all. It's universal, because it cannot be. But anyway, very good.
No, I mean, going also back to the question before, in knowledge, for example, we show or we challenge the idea of knowledge created by science. Is it the only way to create knowledge? Of course not. So we also show other methods, or we show storytelling as a way to transfer knowledge as a much more powerful tool than an academic publication.
Exactly.
So we challenge the scientific community itself in every team.
More questions?
Can I just, she said something, Marian said something that really made me think about one of the dangers, Okay, so we are now in a good position, but one of the dangers is this one that she talked about, which is and she actually mentioned in the PowerPoint, the positioning. She wrote, there's one of the slides that says positioning. And this means the physical positioning of the museum, both the museum, it's very much true, this idea of transpassing a barrier for citizens. If they see University of Liège, people will not enter the building, okay? They will not enter. See how many normal citizens enter this building. They don't, okay? Because there's a barrier, there's a wall, invisible, of authority, of legitimacy. We're not authorized to go in. So there is this positioning of the museum, but also the positioning of the universities vis-a-vis the museum, but in general, stay in the department, not stay in the department. So all these are questions that are very much local to be analyzed on a case-by-case study. But perhaps most important is the institutional positioning. And this is a question I get asked a lot, like, in your experience, what is the best, you say you respond to the rector, right? So this is a positioning. But you can also have departmental positioning, in fact, under the dean, under the president of the department. And you can even have a superstructure that is formal or informal positioning anywhere. So this is incredibly important. And there is very little research done about this. Again, students. This is a fantastic. I have a list of PhD and masters, good for university museums if anyone is interested. But this is really something that would be very interesting to study. These new networks, are they formal, informal? Where are they staying? For example, the pole here, we can see that's at the top level of the university. And the only literature I know, in fact, was a study done in the Curator, you know, the journal Curator. This journal published in 2 issues, in 2002, 2003, a study of natural history museums in universities in the southern, I think, two states of the United States, Texas and Arkansas and whatever. And so they defined successful. I don't know how they did it. Sorry, I will not, but I have the reference and I can send you. And then they looked into how successful these museums were according to their positioning, and the dean and the department, these 3 categories, and the dean, department, and university president. And they concluded, in fact, that the one that was more successful, more open to society, and so on, was precisely the one under the top. But that's from a point of view, because I've seen many museums kill collections, like you say, kill collections for research, for use, for everything, because they were displaced, put under a general museum. So this is really a key issue. There's no solution, there's no recipe. Each university, Liège, needs to find its own model, but we could really benefit from a study that looked into cases and compared these cases in different, especially in Europe. I think this is very important to have that information. It can be the difference between life or death. It can be the response to this volatility that we all feel in 24 hours. Everything can change. You can lose your -1 floor because the rector says it's going to be, it's going to be a computer lab. Or we're going to rent it. I heard this. No, we have to close the museum because we need to rent this to Saudi Arabia to train geologists or energy, I don't know what. Okay, so this volatility is fought, I think, with good museums, certainly, but with institutional statute and kind of protecting, defending the museum or the network, or whatever model.
Sorry. Just to react to that, I agree with this relativity, but that's even more important to be also outside the university.
Yeah.
So when you have other stakeholders, when you have publics, when you have partnerships, when you have cities, when when you have other actors involved, in what you're doing, then it's not a big concern of the university.
Yes.
And that's very important to protect that and to be aware of that. It's very important to be part of the university, loyal to the university. No question. This is also very important to be aware of that. With the fragility, but it's not the concern of the university, it's the heritage of everyone. And that's what we have to preserve it. And that's what also we have to make it accessible to the next generation.
Absolutely. Absolutely.
Avant de te rendre la parole à cette thèse, je vais te poser une question sur si quelqu'un dans la salle a encore une intervention rentrée. Je vais te poser une question un peu plus, je le dis en français parce que en fait, les Français sont majoritaires ici. Je sais que je suis français. Je me souviens, il existait des musées à l'université de Gand avant le gouvernement. Je me souviens en particulier du grand musée d'archéologie en Brandenburg, etc. Est-ce qu'ils existent toujours? Ils n'étaient pas véritablement publics, mais c'était arrangé comme un musée. Est-ce que ça existe toujours ou est-ce que tu as trouvé maintenant?
There's a difference between a museum and a collection. I would say for me those were not really museums, but they were open collections, open storage spaces. So those collections still exist, not necessarily on those locations. So that's why we are trying to centralize, when they are endangered in the current space, but they're not managed as museums. They are managed as collections.
And they are present also in
they're displayed also in the So all the collections, whether they're active, non-active, throughout on campus or centralized, they're managed centrally by the government.
Okay. Because it's a collecteur, c'est une question assez liège, évidemment, c'est la relation entre les institutions existantes, on a parlé de la maison de la science, mais il y a aussi l'aquarium muséum qui est, en termes de fréquentation et en termes de collection, une institution majeure au sein de l'université. Donc la relation entre ces différentes unités qui existent et le pôle muséal. Et c'est cette relation qu'on doit essayer de définir et d'articuler. L'articulation avec les services scientifiques, mais il y a aussi l'articulation avec les différents acteurs. Et l'intention, enfin, Jean-Louis qui a dit hier, n'est pas de tout rassembler en un seul endroit, une seule unité, mais de trouver les modalités, les meilleures modalités d'organisation.
I mean, we're still in some kind of a transition. It's changing. I mean, it's a mind shift for a lot of people. What happens when you start with a central entity? I do think it's important that the museum, the mall, whatever, the central entity gains some kind of a mandate from the rector, from the board of the university to manage. Also legally, because what we witness now is that the departments claim ownership of the collection. But of course, the university is owner, not a department, and sometimes we see now that the departments donate collections to other universities, to other museums. And it's like, you don't even have the legal right to donate. So the expertise, also the legal expertise, should be within the central entity, I think. Which does not mean that they cannot use or use it in a exercise or whatever. But I mean, to have this mind shift from ownership towards I can use it, but I don't own it. That I mean, that takes time. But it's important that that message also comes from the top of the university. Yeah.
Thank you.
And if I could add that there are no, again, I would like to give some examples of poles that are totally different. For example, in Italy, they're all equals, the points of the poles, okay? They're all equal, whether it's a collection, an archive, the building, a museum, they're all equal, including division of a budget, because the Sistema Museale runs the budget, annual budget, so that's one model. But then you have models we're more like the GAM, or for example, in my own university, where there's one museum, or in Strasbourg, for example, where there's one museum, or Utrecht, or Uppsala, that I mentioned, for example, when there are already existing structures with people capacitated, you know, trained and so on, they kind of assume this role of bringing access, bringing conservation, and so on. So you can have an eccentric network where there is more capital, so to speak, on one. And for example, the University of Rio de Janeiro, the Federal University of Rio de Janeiro, the museum that was destroyed by the fire, it's exactly like this, you know. So you have a big museum, and then multiple around. So you really have to find out what is really the tradition here, and what is where you have the resources, the capacity. But at the same time, you need to be inclusive. Do this inventory, she calls inventory, I call it survey, which is like go into every door, knock on every door, find out what exists, and have a clear mandate from the rector to valoriser. That's the encompassing word. I think that's a very important thing to say. There are really no solutions.
Thank you.
Just before talking again, just to react, because we talked about this, it really reminds me this dynamic of open science, because there is a kind of, we know that there is economical things behind that, but it's also a kind of sharing. You know, there's admitting that there is a collective property, not an ownership of data and so on. So I think the collections, so it's not only a question of property, but collective sharing, it's also a question of recognition of legitimacy of people who will be in charge of this collective property also. So that's very important.
Merci. Le temps est venu de la synthèse maintenant, et c'est Sébastien Soubiran qui est chargé de cette synthèse. Alors, je ne sais pas si les gens nécessaire de le présenter, puisque déjà touché, mais enfin, il vient de Strasbourg, il est nouveau, si je veux dire, directeur du musée de la maison des sciences, le jardin des sciences, voilà, de Strasbourg, puisqu'il a succédé à lui il y a quelques mois, je pense. Et par ailleurs, avec une formation de physicien et historien des sciences, donc, à la fois ce qui est le plus dur aux sciences, la physique, la plus fondamentale en tout cas, et de une vision historique qui est bien utile, on l'a vu tout à l'heure, dans le monde des musées et des scientifiques en particulier. Et il est par ailleurs président de l'universitaire, c'est ça, qui est président de l'universitaire. Je lui cède la parole.
Merci.
Ah, pardon. Ah oui, excusez-moi. Oui, vous avez raison. Excusez-moi. Pardon. Merci. It's very impressive. Okay. I'm gonna be lazy. I'm gonna talk in French. It's a bit easier because I'm really stressed. Huh? I didn't realize when they asked me to synthesize, to act as the synthesizer, that it will be so stressful because you're the last to talk, and apparently they're expecting you to say probably clever things, you know. And well, okay. So all the speakers just go down and down in stress, and I'm getting higher and higher in stress. So. Okay, anyway, so as I said, I will be lazy. Thank you for the translator, because I'm going to talk in...
And maybe it's easier for me also to do this exercise of synthesizing.
I can still, in English, I can easily still thanks the organizers and thanks for the invitation. I feel very honored to be part of this process at the University of Liège. I've been invited twice. So the first one questioning the topics within the University Museum, and this one questioning the frontiers. Thank you very much to Thomas here for the whole organization and the invitation and the inspiration to the text. I think you participated to writing of the intention, and also to Vanessa Amoa, because she's a super organizer. I never had this kind of organization of my traveling. Really, I received a note with everything on it, what time I will be coming. There was a taxi waiting for me, and so on. Thank you so much for that. It was very, and on top of that, I had to change my ticket for the return. So thank you. Anyway, so now I'm switching in French. D'abord rappeler que l'exercice que je vais faire, évidemment, forcément partiel et partial, mais évidemment, ces deux jours ont été très stimulants. Très stimulant, alors je pense pour plein de raisons évidemment évidentes, qui est, comme on le sait tous dans une université, que ces rencontres, ces colloques sont vraiment un moment d'échange et qui nous enrichissent chacun. Je pense que pour moi, c'était un des premiers colloques auxquels je participe en live, en in situ, comme on dit maintenant, après la Covid. Ça m'a permis de sortir aussi de mon institution. Je pense que j'en avais besoin également. Parce que voilà, on est chez soi, c'est bien en visio, mais on s'aperçoit que c'est aussi bien de ce trajet, aller vers l'autre, c'est aussi important. Donc merci également pour m'avoir donné l'opportunité de faire ce voyage, et ce voyage qui me permet aussi d'être un voyage intellectuel, sans paraître trop prétentieux. Donc, en posant la question des musées universitaires, pourquoi faire, notre premier vice-recteur Jean Vinant et président du pôle muséal et culturel nous rappelle que dans les universités du XXIe siècle, la place du musée et des collections qui ont participé à la construction et la transmission des connaissances des universités modernes qui se sont construites au XIXe siècle, comme l'a rappelé Martha, est loin d'être une évidence. Donc Martha est bien revenue sur ce processus d'amour et désamour vis-à-vis de légitimité et d'illégitimité peut-être des musées au sein des universités. Tes réponses, Denis, sont malgré tout rassurantes et témoignent du renouveau décrit par Martha, une fois encore, des musées universitaires et la mobilisation depuis plus de 20 ans de nouvelles communautés d'acteurs, chercheurs, professionnels de musées qui ont œuvré à l'échelle locale, nationale, européenne, internationale, à redonner du sens à ces musées, et la dynamique incroyable des musées belges en est le meilleur témoignage. Et d'ailleurs, avec Martin, on se dit qu'il va falloir quand même qu'on mette des étudiants sur cette question. Pourquoi tout d'un coup en Belgique, on a une émergence de musées universitaires? Comment? C'est le surréalisme. Parfait. Première réponse, donc. Le schéma proposé par Jean en préliminaire inscrit, en même temps qu'il le questionne, le rôle du musée dans les missions fondamentales de l'université, la recherche, l'enseignement, le dialogue avec la société, ce qu'on appelle plus généralement the third mission à l'échelle internationale, même si en France c'est la 4e ou la 5e, mais ça permet que tout le monde se comprenne. Bien que la question soit posée sur la signification du musée universitaire, localisé au sein de l'université ou participant à l'activité de l'université, la réponse est sans équivoque. Le musée doit s'inscrire dans les missions de l'université et il le conçoit même comme un outil devant accompagner les changements à l'œuvre, les défis auxquels nos universités sont confrontées et que la crise a rendu plus visible, la crise sanitaire, a une nécessité plus aiguë de légitimer la connaissance scientifique, voire défendre la connaissance vis-à-vis des croyances et des opinions. Un nouveau pas est franchi en aplanissant la tension, souvent persistante, dans les communautés scientifiques entre le rôle de patrimonialisation et de conservation des musées et une activité de recherche et une institution qui se veut tournée vers l'avenir. Comment réconcilier passé, avenir, présent? Une recherche, la physique fondamentale, qui doit innover et être tournée vers l'avenir, mais qui malgré tout, de temps en temps, remobilise ces vieilleries, mais pour construire un discours. Au contraire, il considère cette spécificité des musées universitaires comme une force. À la fois le conservatoire d'un socle premier à partir duquel on construit un raisonnement et un lieu qui permet de problématiser et avoir un discours pour répondre à un doute des critiques. Cette légitimité est fondamentale et répond à plusieurs challenges qui sont soulignés. Pour la mission de recherche, reconnaître une valeur scientifique intrinsèque des collections, elles sont des archives ouvertes de la connaissance, des grands instruments scientifiques dont la recherche peut nourrir peut nourrir des recherches futures dans plusieurs domaines de la connaissance, voire ouvrir de nouveaux champs de connaissances. Le musée est alors une fenêtre ouverte, comme les bibliothèques et les portails numériques des sciences ouvertes, qui est un enjeu fort des universités aujourd'hui. Je me permettrai toutefois de souligner qu'un préalable à cela est d'offrir les conditions de leur préservation, de leur documentation, mais aussi et surtout de leur accessibilité. Pour la mission d'enseignement, les collections témoignent de la matérialité des savoirs et peuvent contribuer à décloisonner les apprentissages disciplinaires qui avaient l'air aussi d'être quelque chose sur lequel on s'entendait. Et le risque de former des techniciens idiots, je crois que c'est ça que tu as utilisé, pour reprendre les mots du vice-recteur, notamment en mobilisant les sciences humaines et sociales et leur réflexion sur les objets, les collections. On peut s'appuyer pour cela sur la dynamique des curricula intégrant, des formations, intégrant des enseignements par l'objet, Object-Based Teaching, et pour lesquels les musées universitaires ont été moteurs. Je pense qu'il faut le rappeler. Alors, il y avait une question économique pour les musées anglo-saxons qui ont eu besoin de retrouver une place dans l'enseignement au moment où ils ont augmenté énormément les fees des étudiants, donc légitimer leur position. Mais au-delà de ça, ça a vraiment permis de remobiliser cette matérialité de l'objet et de permettre aux sciences humaines et sociales d'intégrer justement des cursus scientifiques ou, comme le soulignait Marianne, de remobiliser le musée et les collections comme un objet d'étude, y compris pour certains domaines des sciences humaines et sociales. Enfin, concernant la troisième mission, en répondant notamment à la crise de légitimité du savoir scientifique rendue plus aiguë par la crise sanitaire, les collections sont le témoignage des données qui ont servi à construire un raisonnement scientifique et permettent d'expliciter la méthodologie qui accompagne le mode de production de connaissances. Le musée sert alors à construire une narration sur le rôle de l'université dans la production des savoirs. Mais alors, et là je pense que c'est un point essentiel, quelle narration faut-il construire et avec qui? Cette proposition stimulante a pu être mise en regard au-delà des frontières de l'université. C'était un peu l'objet du colloque, regarder au-delà des frontières. D'abord par Boris Vassiot, qui témoigne de l'impact de la pensée postcoloniale sur le musée d'ethnographie de Genève et des changements radicaux nécessaires qu'il a accompagnés pour redonner du sens au musée et aux collections. Comment décoloniser le musée en changeant de posture vis-à-vis des publics, de ses partenaires, de l'université notamment, mais aussi pour le personnel du musée, en cassant les habitus, en diversifiant les compétences. Comment permettre un partage des pouvoirs? C'est les termes que tu as utilisés et vraiment qui me parlent beaucoup, dans les manières de collectionner, de classer, de représenter, d'interpréter, de collaborer et de communiquer. Comment réinterroger la notion d'autorité des savoirs? Je pense que c'est aussi quelque chose qu'on a évoqué, cette autorité de la connaissance, en exposant la méthodologie, les processus, certes, mais peut-être surtout en étant ouvert au partage, à la discussion et à la co-construction. Ici, il ne s'agit pas juste de mettre en évidence la méthodologie, à mon sens, et les processus de construction, mais aussi d'impliquer les publics, d'impliquer d'autres acteurs, de reconnaître une part active à d'autres acteurs dans la construction de ces savoirs. Ces nouvelles pratiques doivent s'accompagner d'une compréhension poussée de ces publics, construire une stratégie avec une vision claire et compréhensible par le public et les partenaires pour favoriser leur appropriation. Favoriser l'appropriation de cette stratégie, je pense que c'est vraiment ce que tu as mis en avant, construire une stratégie qui soit intelligible, qu'on puisse partager et ensuite sur laquelle on puisse bâtir des partenariats et sur laquelle aussi on puisse rendre plus facile l'accessibilité ou en tout cas la participation de nos publics. Les musées universitaires, parfois, réfléchissent peu à leur public. C'est-à-dire qu'autant les musées sont obsédés par les publics, c'est très bien, autant dans l'université, parfois, cette évidence de dire mais à qui on s'adresse au-delà des acteurs de l'université, des enseignants ou alors des étudiants, voilà, c'est une question importante et je pense que c'est important de se le rappeler, d'autant plus qu'on voit qu'il y a un mouvement après ce mouvement des musées qu'on connaît bien dans les années 80-90 de retour vers les publics. Il y a maintenant, c'est comment le public peut être intégré dans la construction, dans le dialogue qu'on crée au sein du musée. Si la question postcoloniale sous-tend également la présentation d'Esther Dibitz, il s'agit cette fois encore de mieux prendre en compte le visiteur et notamment ses émotions. Elle a commencé en disant « je ne vais pas parler de faits, mais d'émotions ». Donc, en opposant facts versus emotions. Et la construction des narrations dans les musées avec un agenda politique-social. Donc, vraiment questionner cette question de la narration et mettre en avant l'agenda politique. Marianne nous rappelait l'importance de cette transparence, de savoir d'où on parle, de savoir quelle est notre position et de le rendre intelligible pour nos visiteurs ou pour les publics auxquels on s'adresse. La charge historique des collections, l'image institutionnelle qu'elles véhiculent, les discours qu'elles portent. C'est important aussi de pouvoir avoir conscience de cela pour être prêt à la faire challenger ou en tout cas pour préparer les visiteurs à la comprendre. Elle challenge nos postures et propose de mobiliser les émotions pour être mieux connectés à la société et des publics avec des origines, des savoirs et des histoires différentes. Elle soulève la question de la difficile confrontation avec des mouvements très activistes. Comment construire le dialogue? Est-il possible de construire le dialogue? Je pense que c'est aussi une question qu'on s'est posée pendant le débat. Elle nous a posé la question fondamentale de savoir how your museum relate with communities, inhabitants. Dans quelle mesure la société s'est appropriée les musées universitaires. Donc cette appropriation, cette question du rôle, du sens que peut avoir un musée universitaire pour la cité, pour les habitants, pour les communautés, c'est vraiment quelque chose de fondamental et que nous devons garder à l'esprit. Denis Vidal nous questionne quant à lui sur notre capacité réflexive sur nos propres pratiques. Nous laisser bousculer, comme l'a souligné Rachel, introduire du frottement dans nos pratiques. Avec cette histoire de robot, on introduit un tiers dans le musée et tout d'un coup, eh bien, il casse ce rapport entre le visiteur et l'être humain et l'objet, l'expo, ce qu'on met en exposition. Quelle place alors accorder également à l'humour et à l'anarchie? Je crois que c'était aussi un questionnement fort de ta présentation. Plus fondamentalement, quelle place pouvons-nous accorder à une pensée critique de la société? En s'appuyant sur l'exemple de l'artiste Tim Hunking, qui par les machines qu'il construit, va interroger l'économie politique de l'art et la fonction sociale de l'art. Est-ce qu'on est prêt justement à interroger l'économie de la connaissance au sein de nos universités, le rôle des universités ou l'impact des universités sur la société et comment elles participent à définir ce qui fait société. Avec l'exemple du robot, il illustre la richesse d'un croisement, d'une interaction entre l'art, la technique et la connaissance et rappelle leur dénominateur commun, la culture. Sa proposition de nommer le pôle muséal et culturel le musée Merlin rappelle également que la figure du savant ou du porteur des savoirs n'a pas été aussi monolithique qu'elle peut apparaître à travers le prisme de l'université. Amateurs, artisans, ingénieurs militaires, inventeurs, officiers, entrepreneurs, tous ont participé et participent à la production de connaissances. Les connaissances, comme nous le rappellent depuis de nombreuses années les études sur les sciences, s'appuient sur des pratiques, des savoir-faire, des savoirs tacites qu'il s'agit également de prendre en considération. Comment alors décoloniser l'université et mettre l'université en culture, pour plagier Lévi Leblanc sur mettre les sciences en culture? Voilà donc les questions qui nous sont posées et qui constituent de véritables challenges. Ainsi, à la question « Pourquoi faire ?», il est important d'ajouter « Pour qui et avec qui ?» What for, but also whom for and for whom. En outre, les universités doivent plus que jamais interroger leur posture dans la démocratisation de la gestion sociale, du développement technoscientifique qui affecte nos modes de vie. La crise actuelle me paraît comme un bon révélateur de la science en action et du rôle fondamental qu'elle joue dans nos sociétés. D'une part, comme outil pour mieux comprendre le monde, et d'autre part, dans sa performativité pour le transformer. Rarement nous avons été confrontés, quasiment en temps réel et à si grande échelle, aux processus complexes qui régulent la production de nouvelles connaissances et leur mobilisation dans le fonctionnement de nos sociétés. Si nous sommes préoccupés à juste titre de la façon dont les populations perçoivent la science au travers de la crise sanitaire, par exemple, nous devons toutefois nous interroger sur le discours que nous construirons a posteriori sur le rôle de la science dans la gestion de la crise et la façon dont les nouvelles connaissances ont pu émerger, dont certaines ont été sélectionnées et par qui, pour apporter des solutions. Cette crise nous donne une occasion unique de nous questionner sur l'image des sciences que nous relayons auprès de nos publics. Affronter la complexité de la fabrication des connaissances scientifiques et ne pas offrir une vision simplifiée, souvent portée par les scientifiques eux-mêmes, me paraît plus que jamais nécessaire. Mais je pense qu'on est à peu près tous d'accord sur ce constat. En même temps, il s'agit également de questionner les récits simplistes qui reposent sur le même concept monolithique de la science, ceux d'une science corrompue au service des élites et productrice uniquement de vérités qui arrangent le pouvoir en place. Cela conditionne non seulement notre façon de donner à voir, comprendre les sciences auprès de nos publics, mais aussi la place que l'on souhaite et que l'on doit leur accorder dans la participation à cette mécanique complexe de production de la connaissance et de sa gestion sociale. Il me semble que les musées universitaires sont bien placés pour le faire, à condition toutefois d'admettre ce besoin de distanciation et de réflexivité vis-à-vis des acteurs, des mécanismes et enjeux à l'œuvre dans la production des connaissances scientifiques. Nous avons l'expérience, les savoir-faire, les connaissances des outils de communication, de médiation, de mise en public des savoirs et la créativité pour développer de nouveaux, mais aussi les connaissances pour accompagner de nouvelles recherches, pour enseigner. L'exemple du gun est certainement très inspirant et une belle démonstration du chemin accompli en termes de narration, en assumant le doute, l'erreur dans la démarche scientifique, en mettant en avant la dimension culturelle des sciences, science as a way of thinking, mais aussi en se pensant comme une plateforme pour accueillir et donner la possibilité d'expression à de nombreuses voix, a polyphonic place, mais aussi un lieu où la contemplation, l'expérience esthétique a toute sa place. Comme Martha l'a souligné, les musées universitaires ont su rendre visible au sein de la communauté des musées, su se rendre visible au sein de la communauté des musées à travers UMAC, mais aussi à travers les partenariats locaux. Ces partenariats vont et doivent aller au-delà des institutions muséales. Les autres institutions culturelles, le spectacle vivant, la création artistique. On constate un intérêt croissant du monde artistique pour les questions sciences et société, et notamment, bien entendu, sur les questions environnementales. Je suis sans arrêt, pas sans arrêt, mais je suis souvent sollicité par des artistes, par les structures, les théâtres de Strasbourg, qui souhaitent pouvoir dialoguer avec les scientifiques, mais qui souhaitent intégrer ce dialogue sciences et société dans leur production artistique. Et donc l'université, là-dessus, a un rôle à jouer, et les musées universitaires en particulier. Comme également le rapport avec des associations d'éducation populaire ou les associations de scientifiques amateurs. Là encore, la sollicitation est grandissante. Donc on sent qu'il y a quelque chose qui se passe, ce besoin de dialogue, ce besoin d'aller vers l'université qui reste ce lieu vers lequel on peut se tourner quand il s'agit de réfléchir sur les sciences dans la société. Évidemment, les sciences participatives, citizen science, sont certainement une dynamique dans toutes les variétés de pratiques sur lesquelles elles reposent, qui va dans le sens de cette ouverture. Associée à la remarquable richesse, la diversité des ressources, des personnes, comme l'a souligné Martha, des savoirs et savoir-faire, des étudiants, la liberté de ton, mais aussi la capacité à questionner l'existant, les connaissances actuelles et la société, et surtout au cœur d'une institution qui promeut l'expérimentation et qui sait encourager la prise de risque, qui connaît la valeur de multiplier les points de vue, de regarder sous différents angles. Et nous, musée universitaire, on doit garder cette capacité d'expérimenter, de prendre des risques que n'ont pas forcément les musées d'autres institutions. Les musées et collections universitaires ont donc de nombreux atouts pour aider l'université à relever un certain nombre de défis que nous avons pu évoquer, l'aider à porter par le travail de curation des collections qui témoignent d'un passé parfois compliqué, colonial, la guerre, la pratique de collecte, mais aussi pour jouer un rôle social élargi qui accompagne non seulement le développement des connaissances et leur transmission, mais aussi leur mise en culture, préalable nécessaire à une démocratisation des savoirs. Les 2 jours nous montrent que nous sommes sur la bonne voie, même si nous avons encore de nombreuses questions, mais finalement, savoir se questionner, se remettre en question, est encore une fois ce qui caractérise nos institutions. Même si réfléchir sur les pratiques des autres est toujours plus simple que sur nos propres pratiques. Donc, au travail, chers collègues. Merci. On va peut-être pas discuter la synthèse des... c'est bon.
Voilà. Donc, synthèse pris les cours nous, mais non. Voilà, nous sommes arrivés donc à la fin de notre colloque. La planète écoute. Voilà, c'est la fin, donc c'est toujours un moment un peu spécial parce qu'on va bientôt devoir se quitter, mais on a encore la pause déjeuner qu'on peut prendre ensemble et continuer les discussions. C'est un peu le moment aussi de faire les bilans. Donc, je ne vais pas être très très long là-dessus. Il y a une synthèse d'abord sur le plan académique, mais c'est pas ça qui m'intéresse ici. C'est plutôt sur le plan humain. Ici, je crois qu'on sera tous d'accord quand même pour admettre et considérer que ce colloque a vraiment bien marché. Je pense qu'il y a vraiment on a senti vraiment à différents moments, que ce soit dans les moments académiques comme celui-ci ou dans les moments de pause ou un peu plus festifs, on a vraiment senti que quelque chose se passait entre des gens qui parfois se connaissaient, parfois depuis de certaines dates, mais aussi des nouveaux venus, dont je fais partie, et qui ont, je crois, ont été très bien accueillis, ont été très vite intégrés à cette dynamique. Donc pour ça aussi, je voudrais vraiment remercier tous les participants, les anciens comme les nouveaux. Je crois que ça a vraiment très très bien fonctionné. Alors tout ça n'est pas possible évidemment sans de l'aide. Donc je suis peut-être la personne qu'on voit le plus ex officio, mais tout seul, moi je ne sais rien faire du tout. Et donc c'est aussi, et ça c'est un moment agréable aussi à la fin d'une manifestation, à la fin d'un colloque, d'adresser des remerciements là où ils doivent très justement aller. Alors d'abord, les participants, ceux qui ont accepté d'être nos orateurs, j'en ai découvert un certain nombre que je ne connaissais pas, donc Martha, Marianne, il y a Boris aussi, Denis, Sébastien. Voilà, ça a vraiment été une grande découverte. On a pu souvent parler un peu ensemble aussi, échanger. Remerciements aussi à ceux qui ont animé, alors parce qu'ils ne se sont pas contentés de passer la parole, mais je crois que leur apport, notamment dans la discussion et dans les débats, ont vraiment été très productifs. Donc Yves, André, aussi Rachel, je ne sais pas si je jouais Thomas, qui a fait aussi le go-between à un certain moment. Donc merci à eux aussi. Ils ont vraiment fait en sorte que, comme on dit un peu vulgairement, la mayonnaise prenne. C'est vraiment très très important. Il n'y a rien de pire que de dire qu'on va avoir 1 heure de débat et puis alors, bon, vous avez la parole et rien ne se passe. Nous avons eu tous ces grands moments de solitude. On a tous à un moment donné un peu fait l'expérience de ça. Et bon, je crois qu'ici, ça a vraiment bien fonctionné. Et pourquoi ça a fonctionné? Parce que la salle a répondu aussi. Ça n'a pas simplement été un dialogue entre les intervenants. Ça, c'est quand même des vieux routiers de la parole. Hein. Ils ont l'habitude de prendre la parole. Même quand ils sont là en face, ils veulent encore prendre la parole, évidemment. Mais il y en a d'autres aussi qui ont contribué à faire vivre le débat. Seul petit bémol, peut-être, j'aurais voulu entendre les étudiants aussi, peut-être, s'exprimer, réagir. Mais bon, ça viendra, je vous fais confiance.
Merci aussi à ceux qui ont bien voulu accueillir dans leur collection, petite ou grande, les participants du colloque. Je vois Hervé, je ne sais plus où il est, Hervé, il est où Hervé? Il est là. C'est un véritable électron libre, si je puis dire. Les électrons, on ne sait jamais exactement où ils sont. Donc voilà, et Nathan aussi, voilà, dans des domaines extrêmement différents. Vous avez pu découvrir ce qu'était la papyrologie. J'espère que ça vous a laissé sur votre faim, et comme ça vous reviendrez. Alors, merci Nathan pour l'accueil. Et puis alors merci au pôle muséal de manière générale, mais à Réjouissance, à l'embarcadère du savoir, à la maison des sciences de l'homme. Je crois que sans eux, ce serait moins bien passé, voire pas passé du tout. Merci aussi à Karl d'avoir bien voulu accueillir, mais c'est encore venir, je crois peut-être, ceux qui voudront se joindre à lui pour avoir une vue concrète, cette fois-ci du Trinquehall. Il a déjà eu l'occasion de vous dire un petit peu comme ça, dans des apartés, ce que c'était, mais c'est encore mieux d'aller voir réellement ce qui se passe. Alors merci alors aussi, parce que bon, j'ai cité des institutions ou des lieux comme les messages, l'embarcadère, mais il y a des gens, de vraies personnes qui sont derrière. On a déjà beaucoup parlé de Vanessa à moi, et c'est vrai que c'est un peu notre chantier organisateur, hein, comme on dirait en d'autres lieux. Merci à Rachel et à travers Vanessa et Rachel, merci à Didier aussi, hein, à Didier Runken, qui pilote d'un peu plus haut la maison des sciences de l'homme. Merci à Hervé avec sa casquette, alors cette fois-ci, de l'embarcadère. Thomas, trop de casquettes, mais les plafonds sont hauts ici. Réjouissance. Merci alors à Claudine, que vous n'avez peut-être pas beaucoup vue, mais qui, franchement, elle a été là tout le temps, avant, pour vraiment tout planifier. Elle a vraiment aidé aussi beaucoup Thomas à faire en sorte que les textes soient là. Et alors, elle a été présente ici tout le temps aussi, et elle sera encore là après, parce qu'il y a encore du travail alors après pour que ce colloque ne soit quelque chose. Merci aussi à Stéphane d'avoir été là. Il a fait un peu le paparazzi aussi, donc on pourra utiliser un peu les images qui ont été faites. Voilà, j'espère que je n'oublie personne. Quand on se lance dans des remerciements, c'est toujours un peu le danger. Est-ce que je oublie quelqu'un? Jean-Louis, je ne peux pas citer, mais parce que plus trop dans le champ de ma vision, merci aussi d'avoir amené la séance d'aujourd'hui. Et alors, notre caméra, toujours fidèle, ça va, ça se passe bien, je pense. Voilà. Donc, discret, il nous a câblé, comme ça, on n'a eu aucun couac. Merci à Thomas aussi, qui est là en régie tout au-dessus, fidèle avec lui. Merci, tout s'est vraiment bien passé. Voilà, je crois que j'ai été, peut-être même déjà un peu trop. Si je remercie Yves, qui a animé le... Yves, alors si je dois remercier Yves, alors on va être un peu long, alors, parce que vous l'avez vu évidemment ici, animer une table ronde qui est intervenue évidemment aussi, mais il faut voir aussi l'apport de Yves dans la préparation du colloque. Donc le carnet d'adresse qui est quand même là aussi, et donc c'est lui qui a connecting the dots, comme on dirait en anglais. Donc c'est lui aussi qui a vraiment aidé à mettre les gens en relation, à faire en sorte que des gens qui ne se connaissent pas, mais dont il savait, lui, dans sa science profonde, qu'il pouvait avoir des choses à se dire. Et donc voilà, merci aussi Yves, et puis il reste à bord, bien sûr, pour nous aider à piloter cette entreprise. Voilà, cette fois-ci, je crois que j'ai dit un peu tout ce qui pouvait être dit. Je vous remercie encore une fois, et je vous propose de nous applaudir parce qu'on a bien mérité.